Ladies and gentlemen, today is July the 2nd, 2023, and we are going to jump into some world discussion with Agent Smith. This is foreign policy. This is a discussion on economics, world history, and current events. If you have any contributions to this conversation, don't hesitate to reach out in the Twitch chat, and you can be looped into what we are talking about without any further delays. Hold up. All right, we're delayed. How much is that? No way, bro. No way, bro. That's 0. Is that 1,000 USD? It's not. It is. There's no way that it is. It is? Chris A. Zerg, the absolute mad lad, has bounced the timer from a cheeky breeky 11 hours, and we are guaranteed into fucking Wednesday or some crap. Jeez. Wow. You didn't even know you could cheer that many bits. All right. We are off to a start. Chris Hazerg doesn't mess around. Day 9 guaranteed. I just need a minute. I need a minute to process this. I was like going back to the stream and I was like, man, I don't know. It's going to be, the timer could run out during the night and I don't know if we're going to make it. And then I sit back down and it's like, well, shit. The timing was epic. Yes. 1K. Enormous. A gargantuan rhinoceros of support. Jeez Louise. Chris Azerg, thank you for sponsoring the Neuro Subathon. With your generosity, I hope the content has been amusing for you. Okay. Now without any further delays, unless you want to delay it some more, we'll begin world discussion. I'm going to jump into the chat. If anyone has any questions, you can tag me, or if another moderator's around and they want to help, they can do so. But let's begin some world discussion with Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello.
Yo.
Hey. How are you?
I'm doing well. Just trying to fight against the oppression of Britain, against my lovely home nation of Scotland. How are you?
I wasn't aware of any ongoing oppression.
Yeah, it's Longshanks has been a thorn in the side of the Scottish people. He's been taxing us aggressively, and I've been trying to get Robert the Bruce on my side to kind of bring it back for the Scottish people. I don't know if you opened the stream, but I'm William Wallace today.
Oh, is that what you were going for? Okay.
Yes.
Makes sense.
I'm William Wallace with a twist. I have the outfit and the sword, but I have the face paint color of William Wallace, but the design of it is of a black metal artist that I enjoy named Abath. I've had lots of people tell me that my cosplay is incorrect when really this is my twist. This is my William Wallace gamer headset. You've seen Braveheart, yeah?
I've seen most of it, and it was a long time ago when I was a little kid.
You didn't watch the whole movie? That's pretty good. Chat, what would you rate Braveheart as a movie from 1 to 10, where 10 is perfect? I'd give it at least a 9.
Pretty good, huh?
Yeah. The cool thing about it is the main character, he's more of like a real dude than the legends about him, and it kind of touches on some of that commentary of actual people in history that get romanticized or hyped up somewhat, of like, William Wallace was 7 feet tall. William Wallace could shoot lightning from his arse and fireballs from his eyes and all this kind of stuff. And he has a pretty lean, strong build, kind of similar to Kukio and myself. where he's not a giant dude and he beats a lot of larger characters in combat by outsmarting them or by throwing a rock in their face or whatever. But it's a very good movie. It's not historically accurate 100%, but it's not really meant to be. But it definitely has some epic bagpipe music, cool battle scenes, and yeah, Sophie Marceau is very good looking, so that helps.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I remember people in Scotland not being entirely enthralled with the inaccuracies.
oh, it's absolutely an American movie. It's basically, that's the funny thing about a lot of movies that we make. Like King Arthur is another one, where it's a story that Americans know and it's told in an American way and it doesn't actually strive for accuracy. So anyone who knows the actual legends of the character could be upset by that. But yeah, it's fictional, historical fiction. Oh yeah, the funniest moment was the army switch. Yes, that was amazing. The ratings in chat though, we got an 8.7, an 8, a 9, an 8, a 6.9 out of 10, a 9.9, a 9.5, an 8, a 10, and a 9. So very highly rated. Would recommend.
Yeah, pretty glowing reviews. Yeah, it was on in the background. So it wasn't something I saw start. I just kind of walked in and started watching it way back in the 1990s.
Ooh. Simpler times.
Very different.
One of the things I was talking about regarding the 90s was newspapers. I fondly remember in the mornings on the weekend, whenever we're having breakfast and stuff, Dad would read the newspaper, and it was like the Dallas Morning News or whatever. And the thing about newspapers is once you've read it from the front to the back, it's over. You've read the news. You could reread the news, but that's the news. Nowadays we have cable TV that has 24-hour news cycle, and that I think makes news a lot different in terms of what is delivered to people per word. You've got a lot more emotion in the content, a lot less just reporting of the facts, because you got to fill time. Like if you've basically articulated all the events that happened, then you start talking about people's opinions on things. And I think that's caused us to stray a little bit from the path in terms of just letting the facts speak for themselves and letting people decide what they're going to do with that and how they're going to interpret that. So chat, this is a reminder to you as we talk about stuff. Let it be known that sometimes we receive bad information and sometimes our perspective doesn't involve the complete picture. So make up your own mind about stuff. That's a challenge to you. Chris A. Zerg is being an absolute mad lad supporting the Neuro Subathon. We are day 7 of being continuously online.
Oh, yeah.
It's been nonstop.
How's that going?
It's been epic. Last night we got to do a bunch of really silly YouTube videos. We picked up a new YouTube thumbnail artist recently, so the content is going to be even more professional and polished on YouTube. Thank you, Possum Wizard, for that. Chris A. Zerg has been throwing down, and there's a timer that runs that basically decides how long we're going to stay online, and it's ticking down just normally. And then whenever anyone subscribes or donates, then the timer goes up. And I've got a whole bunch of different goals. I think I sent you that video of Kukyo and I doing the lightsaber stuff before.
Yeah.
We did another larger video that was me going over the old school Neuro videos. And he was in the oatmeal video as well. And those are like the first origins of us trying to make gamer YouTube content. And not very many views for it. We were playing Star Wars Old Republic, which didn't end up really taking off as a super popular game, but we had Jedi robes and we got some sticks, wrapped a bunch of duct tape around them, and then Kukyo had a bunch of really fancy like European import spray paint, and he spray painted his green and spray painted mine blue, and we made our lightsaber noises just vocally. But that was a good time. We did hear from chat that they want to see more of that silly IRL content, so.
Whoa, oh
Whoa, whoa.
Yeah, got an endorsement.
Oh no! Oh, what the
Yes.
fuck? Oh!
Well, I look forward to future such endeavors.
Me too.
Yeah, I remember that back in the day. He was kind of doing that even before, probably even he met you, because I remember him doing that in college when we were undergrads.
Yeah.
If we can just kind of tell a story of Kukio a little bit, I met him through musical theater class, and he was the type of person.
Whoa, oh no! Oh, what the fuck?
Chad is being absolutely insane. Thank you so much, Chris A. Zerg and Al Sadare, for the mountains of support. We met Kukio in musical theater class, and he was in the bass section. Nice, resonant, deep voice that he had. Pretty good vocal range as well. And he was one of those rare people who could be the class clown, but as soon as a boundary was reached, he would immediately be a gentleman. So he wasn't someone who was off the rails and just consistently being obnoxious. He would be funny and really lighthearted, cracking jokes, keeping the attitude really light. But if the professor said, all right, now we need to focus, instant focus. That's something that I think is a really important life skill, is knowing how to find the balance between comic relief and being obnoxious and trying to find that right balance. And the after parties that we had for musical theater performances, we would perform Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And then on Sunday night, they would host a party at one of the other bass section dudes' apartment, and we would get super duper drunk. And once people were really drunk, Kukio would just challenge people to wrestling. That was one of the things that we did. And he would show people wrestling moves. You laugh because you could probably see him doing that.
Yep.
But he wasn't mean about it. He would be teaching people moves of like, okay, this is this hold. This is how you get out of this hold. This is how you do that kind of hold. And musical theater people are super fun. Anyone who's done theater and had an after party, those are some of the best parties because everyone's really artistic, charismatic. They're very open personalities. So that was a very good time, but definitely made itself or lended itself well to us making silly videos together because he was not afraid to be a silly goose. And that's definitely a point of freedom. If I can give an example of a movie that inspired me that it's okay to be silly, it would be The Court Jester. I think I mentioned that one to you before. But the lead actor in that one, he basically plays the village idiot who has to go undercover in disguise as the Black Fox, who's like the most ace assassin and like archer and stuff. But he's just a regular dude. But he has to act like he's a fool and like he's an expert throughout the course of the movie. So that showed me that for you to be really skilled at something doesn't mean that you need to stop being silly and try to be cool all the time. You can absolutely be silly, and that makes people a lot more relaxed around you. You come across as a lot more genuine and authentic and a lot more sturdy in your security. If you can be a goober and still just be yourself and have fun, that's a lot more enjoyable for people to be around than someone who's strictly trying to be super cool and do everything right all the time. That's a little bit more fragile of a mindset. So yeah, we watched the old school Neuro stuff, and I'll probably do some remakes of some of those videos.
Oh, cool. That'd be
Based
fun.
Kukio. Yep. But yeah, I asked the chat earlier if they had any news events that they wanted to discuss. There was someone who asked about Ukraine, and we normally do a kind of Ukraine update, so we can probably get to that at some point. I didn't see too much that in the headlines that really drew my attention. Some former Trump person said that they saw him showing people documents to the surprise of no one, but that's just a self-report thing. So we'll have to see where that goes. I think a lot of people are very jaded with the whole, like, Trump's in trouble. Maybe he's going to jail. It's like,
Yeah.
we'll see. When it happens, it happens. But if it doesn't happen, I'm not going to hold my breath.
Yeah. No surprise.
And then the rest of the chat is saying France, France, France.
Yeah.
How are the French so good at being upset, and how can we learn from them and how to protest and do stuff? What did they do?
I mean, it just comes down to political culture, right? It's France has a history of very proactive protests going back to the French Revolution, and that's become normalized over time. It kind of gets renewed and reiterated with each generation.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know that it's something you can necessarily emulate, given how different American political culture is.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we haven't had the same kind of tumultuous history. You know, some of that tumult is rooted in the divide between the Catholic right and the Republican left, which is a common running theme in a lot of Latin countries like France, Spain, Italy, etc. Back in the 19th century and early 20th century, they competed very hard over influence in their respective political systems. And, you know, that was sort of the driving force behind a lot of tension and conflict in those societies. You can see that not only in France, you know, with regard to things like the occupation during World War II, you know, where you had sort of the Pétain right wing of French politics oppressing sort of the left wing resistance forces. And then you see it in Spain in the Spanish Civil War, where conservative forces that were very, you know, pro-monarchy, pro-Catholic Church, fighting quite ruthlessly, you know, against the Republicans that were trying to defend the Spanish Republic during the war. And in Italy, you can see it during the, I don't know that it was as pronounced in Italy as it was in France and Spain, but, you know, they did have things like the Years of Lead during the Cold War. And then also a lot of political intrigue, you know, involving the Papal States over the course of sort of the late medieval period and early modern period.
Pronunciation papal.
Papal States, thank you. So, you know, that lent itself to a lot of very feisty politics. You know, there was a lot of tension and it manifested as conflict between these two groups. And so that kind of fed that proactive political culture where people really went out and protested hard, you know, against rival factions. And then that kind of merged into the emerging divide in the late 19th century between labor and capital. So, you know, the Republican left kind of evolved and fused to a degree with the emerging socialist left. And the Catholic right sort of itself fused and merged with the pro-capital nationalist right. And so those became two competing political coalitions with very amorphous, you know, boundaries between the different allied constituent groups. And of course, you know, battles between capital and labor are quite famous for how contentious and violent they can be in the late 19th century and early 20th century. So that just further perpetuated sort of that tension, you know, that fractious politics that manifests as open, maybe not open political violence per se in France, but, you know, very stern, active, borderline violent mass protests. And, you know, that just became the norm over time. Like if you were serious about politics, then you protested, you went on strike. You know, you had to kind of voice your interest and actively fight for it. You know, the Anglo-Saxon notion that politics should be relatively polite and that people should respect certain boundaries does not really exist in certain other developing countries. So different cultures, different histories, different political cultures, etc. That's my understanding of why that is. You know, if you want a more specific answer, then you can say that it has to do with labor unions being much stronger. You know, organized political parties in general are much more organized in Europe, but also interest groups like organized labor unions, etc. in France are much more organized, strong, and coherent. You know, they have much stronger leadership than in even other countries in Europe, but certainly much more so than in the United States. And they, of course, are very proactive in, you know, defending their interests in French politics by leveraging the power of labor in the French economy. And so, you know, not every mass protest in France has the backing of unions. some of the mass protests in the 1960s, being a case in point. But in general, unions tend to support like-minded left-wing allies in French politics. And so the power of French labor unions lends the political left in France more heft than it has in equivalent, peer nations like the United States. I would point out that the current protests in France, though, are not necessarily reflective of that tradition. These protests are more like the French equivalent of race riots and race protests in the United States. Are you familiar with sort of the genesis of the current round of protests?
Was this when they were doing the retirement age change? Is that what it started with?
No. That was the genesis of some earlier protests, but these current protests have to do with the police shooting.
Oh.
Yeah, I don't know if you'd heard about that, but the police had a traffic stop, and the guy they were talking to was a younger guy. I think he was like a teenager or maybe 21, something like that. And he stopped, he interacted with the police pointed a gun at him. It's not entirely clear what the lead up to the shooting was about, but he eventually decided to try to drive off without permission. And when he did, the officer who was pointing a gun at him shot him. And he died shortly thereafter. There was footage of his car sort of crashed against a post, and presumably he was inside dead at that point. And, that would be probably grounds for some unrest in and of itself. Police shootings generally are of that vein, because it seemed clear that he wasn't really being a threat to the police. He was just fleeing from a checkpoint without permission, and he would have been punished for that, presumably, if he hadn't been killed. But as was, he was shot and killed, and so people thought that was disproportionate use of force, and riots and protests correspondingly. But the bigger issue is that the man in question was of North African origin. Well, not origin per se. He was a French national, French citizen, but he was of North African ancestry. And that made the killing more sensitive than it would have been otherwise. Because France does have a sizable minority of North African descent within it that has complained for decades about discrimination within French society, and by disproportionate attention and violence from the French police. And it doesn't help that a lot of people of North African background end up in these what are called banlieues, which are basically suburbs of major cities in France, where they tend to become ghettoized. They tend to live in very poor communities that are disadvantaged, marginalized, have few opportunities, and are generally afflicted with a number of social maladies, like crime, poverty, etc. And so that tends to propagate and perpetuate the problems of poverty that those communities experience. So there was already a lot of tension within those specific communities about supposed, alleged discrimination from broader French society and the police in particular. And so when one of their number was, basically executed on the street, by French policemen, that really set them off. And that's sort of really the more important, factor that has led to the current round of riots and protests. And there are other groups of minorities within France, from sub-Saharan Africa and some East Asian, but I think the North Africans are the largest, especially Algerians. And they have complained for a long time about, this problem. So this is basically just the latest round of social unrest stemming from that problem. The last big one was 2005, I believe, where there were some big protests in the banlieues, and I think about a week or so of rioting that ended up destroying a bunch of property. The French government made some effort to try to ameliorate the issue. It kind of started some outreach programs and tried to get more people into government and more minorities into the police force, for example. But clearly, the underlying problem has not been entirely resolved to the satisfaction of the communities in question, to the point that the current riots and protests are feasible. So clearly there is still work to do in that vein. It's interesting to watch the politics around this in France, speaking as an American, because they deal with it in a different way than we do. Here in the United States, we have a history of slavery, history of oppression, segregation, Jim Crow laws. And so racial politics are much more fraught in that sense. They're much more charged. And so, riots and whatnot that stem out of unrest stemming from cases of discrimination, oppression, etc., tend to be, almost borderline justified by some parties in America just because of the history. And so, that just creates a very complicated mess of, race politics in the United States that anybody living here is pretty familiar with at this point. But in France, their race politics, if you can call it that, are different. In France, they have a much stronger notion of republicanism that really colors their political culture. So, in the minds of the French, it doesn't matter what your race, creed, or background is, everybody is French. And everybody should be treated equally on that count.
Could you define republicanism for people who are going to think that means Republican American Party?
Oh, yeah, it's more about just the ideal of a republican form of government, where the government is a republic, and the citizenry have special responsibilities towards that republic as members of a broader nation state. So republicanism in France really has its origins in the French Revolution, where they overthrew the monarchy and created what was hoped to be, and what proponents strived for it to be a republic of equals. So they really wanted to fight against notions of autocracy or elite sentiment that would create divisions between people based off of class or perceived privilege. They really wanted things to be more flat than that. And to a degree, you can argue they went too far. Certainly, the French Revolution was known for certain excesses. But in general, that became a key component of the French definition of democracy. Republican ideals of equality are very pronounced there. And, when Americans talk about it, they generally talk more about the economic side of that. The French notion of economic equality is quite notable from an American perspective, because we don't have that. It's very different here. But in France, they really strive to try to ensure that everybody has equal footing economically, and that there's a social safety net, social spending, strong unions, etc. But the flip side of that coin is that you're not really supposed to think in terms of different ethnic groups or races or whatnot. That's not considered to be a Republican way of thinking. And so the broader mainstream view is that this is the wrong way to look at it, and that people who try to look at politics through the lens of race are actively undermining Republican ideals and are actually making the problem worse. So the sense in France is that it's better to try to hold up the Republican ideal of equality as the solution to this problem. In fact, the former socialist prime minister of France, Francois Hollande, in an article I read recently, actually explicitly said that. He explicitly said that the Republican ideal is the way that we address this issue. I don't think anybody would suggest that there's not some underlying issue there, owing to racial background, or that ties into racial discrimination. But the French body politic does not think racializing the problem is going to make it better. Their view is that while there can be efforts to try to ameliorate discrimination, overall, the broader emphasis should be on ensuring that everybody sees their fellow citizens as equal, regardless of their race, ethnicity, etc. And that, of course, has led to some commentary from Americans, because, again, this is something that's just inherently different in the political cultures here in the United States. The argument that everybody should be colorblind and that people should view their fellow citizens as equals, regardless of their background, has come under increasing scrutiny. That's seen increasingly as kind of more of a conservative viewpoint. There's a sense that, yes, colorblindness has its place. You should treat everybody equally, but certain people of certain backgrounds have a unique history that deserves attention and deserves some degree of special attention and rectification. So that particular viewpoint is one that has emerged and become increasingly dominant over the past 10 to 20 years in particular. But in France, that's just not how people think about it. You can see intellectuals making that argument, but they've experienced a significant degree of pushback in France on that count. And it doesn't seem like they're getting a lot of traction within French politics. It doesn't help that that viewpoint is seen as being very American, which is always a bad point, for any viewpoint or public policy proposal in France. They do not have a high opinion of American politics in France, and so ideas that are seen as having an American origin are definitely discounted on account of it.
So basically, as one of the pioneers of throwing off monarchy and oppression, the French have a very keen sense of kind of fairness and striving for that ideal form of government and treatment of the people. And one thing that we've talked about too is the French identity is about how you live rather than who you are by ethnicity. So if there is some systemic discrimination in a way that ends up being a really obvious case of disproportionate use of violence, as in this recent killing, yeah, it would make sense that they would be rather upset. A little bit similar seeming to the George Floyd situation in the U.S., but like you said, the history of the U.S. and France are pretty different in terms of migration patterns and the history of slavery and so on.
Yeah, that's not to say that France does not itself has its own history of slavery. Certainly, Haiti is probably the main, case in point. But within France itself, they don't have nearly the same experience. In terms of the actual metropole, territorial France in Europe, I don't think they ever had widespread slavery like we did in the United States. So the riots and protests are ongoing. There's been an immense amount of property destruction, and I think even the family of the man who was killed has come out now and said that the riots and arson in particular are not helping, right? They want justice for their son, for sure, but their argument is that they are not explicitly anti-police. They just want the police in question that committed the crime to be punished and for the police to make more of an effort to not abuse people. Also, they point out, and this is something that's also been talked about, there was a law that was passed, I think, 10, 15 years ago that gave police broad discretion to use lethal force in the case of people failing to stop at a traffic stop or leaving a traffic stop without permission. Which is not to say that they're allowed to just kill you if you don't stop or try to leave without permission, but if they think that you're a threat to the public, as you flee a traffic stop, they are allowed to use lethal force. So that obviously gives an immense amount of discretionary power to individual police. And it also leaves a lot of room for abuse. And so, because police in France don't really use body cameras, to my knowledge. So it would not be a stretch to think that the police could maybe kill somebody on dubious grounds, and then maybe just claim that I thought he was a threat to public safety. And so then maybe there would not be accountability in that case. So the problem there is obvious as far as accountability. And so that particular law has come under a lot of criticism. So there may well be a lot of impetus going forward to try to change that. Even if people maybe think the law is not necessarily a bad idea, it may not be a bad idea to change it anyway, just to try to ameliorate people and try to improve accountability of the police in order to try to improve their public image in the wake of all the protests and whatnot that have happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one of the things that a lot of people have had commentary on the U.S. police being very aggressive in its leaning for how they deal with problems and the amount of training and use of firearms as opposed to de-escalating conflicts, because proportionate use of force is a fairly complex thing to do. Like, we're not saying that police work is easy and that they just need to do some simple thing, because you do have a lot of bad actors in the world. You have situations where the police are in a position of great danger and they need to defend themselves and sometimes use force to handle a situation. But Like in these cases, they're making a very aggressive judgment call with very low information for a relatively low-level offense, which is going to be an outlier, but still something that needs to be addressed and probably points toward a broader systemic issue.
Mm-hmm.
Did you ever watch the anime Psycho-Pass?
The first season, yes.
Yeah. That one's very good, and it kind of touches on a lot of these concepts of how do you anticipate bad actors doing bad things, and what is the best way of handling that?
Yeah. Yeah, it's difficult to do. You know, you can give police greater discretionary power, but then you have accountability issues. You can tighten standards up, but then the police may feel that they're being held back and prevented from doing as much as they could. Yeah, crime is just an inherently difficult problem. There's not really like great obvious solutions in most cases. You know, invariably any kind of reform is going to have relatively mild impacts, most likely. Unless you're just doing something explicitly stupid, you know, in which case there's room for short-term improvement, significantly so. But if you're just having general crime problems, then no, probably you're looking at relatively mild returns for any significant public policy effort in that area. Let's see, what else did I have on that? I think that was, oh yeah. Oh yeah, the mayor, okay. Yeah, this was a recent thing. I think this was yesterday. So there were some protesters or rioters, however you want to frame it, that attacked the mayor of, what was it, Les Roses? I can't pronounce it. There was a mayor in France who was attacked by protesters, or at least his home was attacked. And his wife and child had to flee their home. And apparently they were injured as they fled. And so that led to a big outpouring of criticism, you know, from the general public. In general, people have kind of been sympathetic, but as the riots and arson have escalated, the public sentiment is kind of starting to turn against the protests. So that was a particularly egregious example. There was also some footage of schools being targeted, and you know, children complaining about it. And of course, like I said before, the relatives of the man who was killed. Oh, teenager. Okay, he was a teenager, 17 years old. So the teenager who was killed, his family has come out and criticized some of the more violent expressions of dissent that have occurred.
That makes sense. I think most parents would do that in
Yeah.
that situation. Yeah, mob mentality is absolutely a thing. Whenever people are in a really fired up state and there are other people reinforcing that, and you're in a large group, there's a kind of power boost for everyone who's there, and it doesn't really keep people in the most rational and logical state. It's more so the angry state, which is a pretty vital social group reaction to situations, because if you are legitimately being oppressed or whatever, that's a way to like use emotion as some fuel to fight against that. But at the same time, it can be hard to calibrate the level of aggression that is proportionate to what you're trying to accomplish, because otherwise you'll end up becoming the bad guy.
Yeah, and part of the problem too is that when you have mass unrest like this, it inherently attracts people who are lacking in inhibition, shall we say.
Yeah.
It tends to attract malcontents of all varieties. You know, there's plenty of people that have a grudge against society, or maybe want to settle a score, or basically just use it as an excuse to loot something. You know, there's been plenty of looting in France recently. So that's definitely been a factor as well. Yeah, you know, mass protests and mass unrest, and in particular, mass rioting, are not always and forever expressions of political discontent. Sometimes they are kind of an ends unto themselves by people who just kind of want to lash out at society writ large. You know, they don't really have particular objectives in mind beyond just taking the opportunity to cause trouble or burn something or steal something or what have you. Now, that's not to say that protests are inherently wrong. If the government is failing to address an issue or if the public is aggrieved, certainly they have a right, if not an obligation, to express that and to try to pressure the government into representing the will of the people. But at the same time, I think it's important to keep in mind that not everybody out there on the street is going to be of like mind. There's going to be a lot of different people with different objectives and different levels of tolerance for violence.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the reasons why it's important for a successful, well-organized protest movement to have strong leadership so that they can calibrate the level of unrest and damage accordingly, according to their political objectives and according to the political environment. That was one of the defining characteristics of the civil rights movement in the 1960s in the United States. The civil rights movement was very well organized, especially in the South, to the point where, if people were, for example, failing to honor a general strike that had been declared, strike breakers would frequently come under significant pressure, if not violence. And rioting and whatnot was generally relatively rare in the American South, which is, again, where most of the civil rights movement was most active. Again, they tended to scale up the degree of public pressure and protesting and whatnot according to sentiment and political temperature at a given time. So they were very smart about it. They had it down to a science. But unfortunately, in the United States, as well as, if not also the broader Western world, movements like that, social movements in general, have become much less organized. They tend to have much less organizational structure, if any. They tend to be much more decentralized in nature. And while that does have its advantages, one of the big disadvantages is that it inherently becomes unwieldy once the movement reaches a certain size.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of saw that with the Floyd protests back in 2020, where once they reached large scale, they kind of spun out of control. You had different leaders at a local level trying to corral people, but just failing. Just people had their own ideas about the degree of pressure, the degree of violence, the degree of unrest that was justified, and correspondingly, the movement fractured, unsurprisingly. And you had a lot of fallout. Some people online tried to justify all of it as just being a natural, inevitable response to oppression in the United States, but that was never going to work. That was never going to be a politically viable approach to the unrest, and especially to the more violent expressions, such as arson and whatnot.
Yeah, the strategy used by the civil rights movement was civil disobedience, which
Mm-hmm.
was basically walking in locations and just maintaining a presence, but not fucking shit up. Where you're going to a place and they're like, "Hey, well, you can't go here," and they'll be like trying to like shoot the people with fire hoses and stuff like that, sometimes with very high pressure, so it was hurting them. But yeah, it wasn't like they were destroying stuff and trying to take out objectives. They were just trying to make their cause known by being very visible in public. And
Mm-hmm.
that is major credit to them making progress in all of their aims and getting their voice out there, is making sure that they stay the good guys of the conflict instead of being the ones who are oppressed and then they escalate things, which is very, very hard to do, especially when you're continually being oppressed even throughout the protesting process. So big respect to the patience of people who fought hard for that without escalating things to a bad level.
Yeah, somewhat ironically, it actually became more violent after the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1965, rather than less. That had to do with the assassination of MLK, as well as broad-based unrest in the United States over the course of the late 1960s. That kind of tied in with the Vietnam War, as well as race riots in places like Watts in Los Angeles and in Detroit. So, passage of the Civil Rights Act did not end discrimination in the United States. It just created legal equality. It ensured that people in the South in particular had their voting rights respected by discriminatory Southern governments. But beyond that, they did not ban general social discrimination. People still, could discriminate. There were limits like employment and whatnot, but in general, it was pretty clear that racism wasn't going away just because there was legal equality. So that just kind of fed general unrest and fed off of general unrest, and the result was some major riots in 1968 in particular.
Yeah, it takes a long time, like you said, for norms to change, and that's really what has to change for the racism to go away. You can change the rule, but you can't change the minds of the people right away. It would take them basically experience in realizing that humans are humans, which if they've been drilled a certain opinion their whole lives that gives them some false sense of superiority, they're going to try to maintain that. It's really interesting, mental inertia. I think a lot about the ideas that people hold as your investment in a poker hand, and life is like a poker game. And the longer that you're invested in a pot and the more chips you put in that pot, the more you want to like see what the outcome is and kind of defend what you have. If you're not very invested in a set of ideas, say, for example, I was around a Scientology building and someone was like, hey, come check out this stuff. And I was like, oh, okay. And I checked it out and some people talked to me for a little bit and I spent an hour there and then I left. And then I looked it up online and found out there's a bunch of fucked up shit with it. It'd be very easy to just drop the whole thing because it's like, oh, well, I didn't have any investment in this anyway. So it's pretty easy for me to walk away. But if you're very invested in a belief system and you've been entrenched in that for decades, then you've got social connections, you've got your standing in that community that matters to you, and all of that has value, and people want to protect their investment. So same thing with hateful ideologies. If that's something that has been a part of your family's tradition for a long time, your family members are oftentimes people you look up to and respect and who are above you in the social strata. So you're going to carry on whatever things that they're saying. And there's a lot more investment there. So you can change the law, but like you said, you can't change their minds right away. They're just going to find different ways of oppressing people that are more subtle.
Unfortunately so.
I think it is still progress, though, because over time, that's basically making it inconvenient for the hateful ideology to manifest really visibly, which is going to get basically the laziest offenders out of the way. And then over time, you just lower the population of haters, pretty much. And we're trying to continue to work on that. But it's definitely a work in progress to investigate and challenge the stereotypes that we hold. People have their opinions and they hold them strongly.
Yeah, social change is slow, but it does happen.
We were talking this week about how foul language has changed from the 90s to current. I remember back in the late 90s, early aughts, a bunch of the slur words were thrown around a lot and people didn't really bat an eye. But if you said fuck, that was like a, you said fuck, oh my gosh, that's like a very naughty word. Or shit. Shit was a pretty bad word as well. But people would say some slurs for some demographics, and I'm not going to say them now, but that was super common, and people wouldn't lecture someone for that, but they would lecture them for saying the F word, and it was very interesting. Nowadays, that's flipped. The slurs are bad because we've basically figured out that those are consistently pushing down historically oppressed demographics, and saying fuck, that doesn't really do much. That just means to sex something, which is not inherently negative.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's been considerable evolution in that vein. Some of that just has to do with the weight of the internet. With communication now so easy and so widespread, it's just much more difficult to enforce norms like that.
Mm-hmm.
Especially back in the day. So that in and of itself kind of shifted the culture a little bit. In general, norms kind of adjust to the enforceability the enforceability of norms, that is to say, is a part of how they stay in place. It's part of how they're propagated. Back in the 1990s, for example, it was relatively easy to enforce social norms about, say, cursing or sexual content in media, because most of the media was controlled by corporations, right? TV, radio, movies, what have you. But communication since then has been, shall we say, democratized by the internet. And as a result, our communications have come to reflect more honestly and accurately the communications of the public writ large. And as we've seen, the public writ large is a little rough around the edges. So, for better or worse, online, well, not online per se, but media rhetoric in general has come to be more coarse, correspondingly. And again, that's a reflection of the norm just getting harder to enforce.
Everyone has a camera now.
Yeah. Now, one interesting factor here, since we're talking about, social change and, some of the driving factors there, it helps a lot if the elites in a given society hold a given set of beliefs, because generally what happens is that people will emulate elite behavior. And so that's a big advantage if you can have elites that reflect, whatever social beliefs you're trying to see become widespread in your society. Because in general, the trend, not always and forever, but in general, the trend for any given society is for the lower classes to sort of adopt the practices of the upper classes. So for a linguistic example, you can look at the UK and at rhotic English, sort of this traditional, what you would think of as a traditional British accent where they kind of drop the R sounds, is not actually traditional. That's actually a relatively recent development that can be sourced to the early mid-19th century. And that was a change that was almost engineered by the upper level of British society to try to distinguish themselves from the rest of British society. And, subsequently, over time, the rest of society followed suit. And now pretty much everybody has a rhotic accented English in the UK. And it's interesting because some linguists actually argue that before that, British English probably sounded more similar to current American English. So it's not the case that we've deviated, it's the case that they've deviated more, which is actually pretty believable, because in general, if you look at customs, practices, and cultures in the New World, in the Americas, they actually tend to correlate with some of the older practices in Europe that date around the 1700s, 1800s. So that's not unrealistic to think that British English may actually have sounded more like American English originally. We just haven't evolved as much, basically, here in the United States. Yeah, if you want another example, you can look at religion in the Anatolian Peninsula, specifically Turkey. When the ethnic Turks first moved into the Anatolian Peninsula, most of the population was not Turkish. Most of them were various Anatolian peoples, especially in the highlands. And then in the periphery of the Anatolian Peninsula, it was mostly ethnic Greeks and ethnic Armenians. But over time, the ethnic Turkish population grew, and also more and more of the non-Turkish population converted to Islam and integrated with the Turkish population. Being a Turkish speaker and ethnically Turkish was seen as synonymous with being a Muslim. And in fact, Turkishness and Islam were sort of basically the same thing. To say you were Muslim meant to say you were Turkish. That's the way it worked in the Ottoman census for several centuries. And so as more and more people naturally adopted, the practices, customs, language, and religion of the elites, because, the Turks were the elites, they were the government, the military, etc. And so naturally people kind of wanted to move up, they wanted to climb the social ladder. And one of the main ways to do that was to adopt their practices and kind of integrate with them. If nothing else, learning the language is like a big help in that regard. So no surprise that more and more people became more and more Turkish. And eventually, a critical mass of converts in that sense was reached, such that the Turkish/Muslim population became the clear majority. So the corollary here in the United States would be things like anti-racism, I guess. And, not every elite in the United States necessarily embraces that, especially the more radical definitions of anti-racism. But in general, America's political elite tends to be fairly liberal-minded. And when I say liberal-minded, I don't mean like the left-wing American definition. I mean classical liberalism, as they call it in the United States. In general, there's a notion that discrimination is anti-liberal, anti-Republican, anti-American. And so in general, elites in the United States tend to eschew that. They don't always embrace every policy proposal to try to deal with it, but all the same, anti-racism is kind of the norm in the United States at the top level. And so over time, you've seen people in the broader American society kind of shift towards that. It used to be that racism was very, very normal in the United States. It wasn't just like a problem, it was the norm. It was almost expected behavior, and people would get mad at you if you weren't racist. Going back to the civil rights movement, which we were talking about before, there was in the 1960s, during the civil rights movement, a big influx of young activists from the northern United States into the southern United States. A lot of white liberals. And in this case, I am talking about the American definition of liberal. There were a lot of white young liberals in the northern United States that traveled to the South in order to try to assist the civil rights movement, and more specifically, to try to mobilize African American voters, get out the vote and whatnot. And the response to that by white Southerners is telling, because the response was a wave of terrorism, like just outright domestic terrorism. Like they called them, the buses that carried these activists down to the South were called Freedom Rides. And these buses were targets of bombings. Like straight up, they would bomb the buses.
Whoa.
Yeah. And also African American communities that were, interacting with the activists and were participating in the civil rights movement would see their churches targeted. They would be the targets of arson or even bombings. Do you remember Condoleezza Rice?
The name is familiar.
She was Secretary of State for the Bush administration in sort of the latter years. I think in the earlier years, she was like a national security advisor.
W. Bush or H.W.?
George W. Bush.
Okay.
And she's African American and, conservative, obviously, serving in the Bush administration. But she actually grew up in Alabama, if I'm not mistaken, and she actually survived a church bombing in the 1960s during the civil rights movement, interestingly. So, this was a big, widespread phenomenon. Like there was an immense violent response, by racist white people in the South to the civil rights movement. And that just illustrates like how widespread that cultural norm was in the South at the time. If you talk to white people in the South during the civil rights movement, their perspective is that they were being invaded. They had this tradition, this custom that was being challenged by people from outside of their region, and they resented it. They thought people were trying to inflict social change on them by force, and they responded, violently. Not surprising given their perspective on the matter. Not to say they were right, but just, given that's how they were framing it, like it's not a shock that they responded violently in that sense. So since then, elites in the United States have shifted away from racism as a norm. In the North, people were less racist, but very clearly you can see that racism was also very prevalent and common there for most of America's history.
Well, wasn't it not just people of African descent, but also among different migrants from Europe and Asia and stuff? They would basically judge people and put them into categories based on how.
Yeah, but you have to be careful about that because, yes, Italians were not considered white. Mediterranean people were not considered white, especially in the late 19th century, early 20th century. But African Americans were in a class apart even then, right? So that is a distinctive group that has been the recipient of some very unfortunate special treatment, quote unquote, over American history. So yeah, racial discrimination in the North did extend to a degree to other groups, Mediterranean groups, Eastern Europeans, etc. But they did not receive nearly the same opprobrium and suspicion that Black people in the South received. That was considered a different group altogether. Yeah, one of the common misunderstandings, even among Americans, is that people who advocated for the end of slavery in the United States were anti-racist, and that's, for the most part, not actually true. In the case of 19th century America, pretty much all segments of society, be they anti-slavery or pro-slavery, wealthy or not wealthy, whatever, pretty much everybody was racist. Everybody saw white people as inherently different, if not superior, to people from Africa, specifically African Americans. That was just super common. That was almost like a given for the majority of people. It was so common that one of the principal ways that Southern elites would try to criticize people who wanted to end slavery was by saying they didn't just want to end slavery, they want equality between the races. And that was considered like a radical position in the mid-19th century. And it was effective ammunition for a long time. That was also one of the ways that redeemers, that is to say, people in the South, in the Reconstruction South, after the American Civil War, after slavery had been banned, one of the ways the sort of conservative Southerners reestablished their power in the Reconstruction South is by creating a coalition of people that involved not just conservative Southerners, but also people who had been more pro-union and anti-slavery during the Civil War, but who otherwise absolutely did not want equality between white people and the newly freed former slaves. And that coalition was able to win largely on the back of sort of a very racialized message that the Republicans in the North were trying to engineer racial equality, which was just widely unpopular in the South, and also to a lesser degree in the North. That was a big part of the Democratic platform for the Democratic Party, that is to say, in the mid-late 19th century United States, and even national politics. And again, that just illustrates how common it was. It was just like a given. Even abolitionists, the people who wanted to end slavery, generally thought in those terms. Wanting to end slavery is not the same thing as advocating for racial equality. And that became very painfully apparent for a lot of newly freed slaves in the post-Civil War South in the United States. Also, to underscore this point, there was an immense amount of debate in national American politics after the Civil War ended about what to do with all of the freed slaves. Like, ending slavery was considered like the right thing to do by the majority of America's population at that time. But what to do with them after the fact, nobody had a plan for that. Like, some people wanted to just ship them off back to Africa. Some people wanted to just, shipping them back to Africa was probably the most popular position. Other people wanted to let them stay in the United States, but did not want to extend citizenship to them. That was also a popular proposition. And then the more radical proposition was to extend citizenship and to actually incorporate them into American society. And the fact that it was the citizenship faction that won that debate did not have to do with idealism. That was very much a realpolitik move. For the radicals themselves, it was idealism. They really thought it was feasible. Although, again, still racist. They didn't think they were racially equal. They just thought that as people living in the United States and who had contributed to the United States, they deserved citizenship and deserved legal rights. Again, distinguish between legal rights and social equality, different things at the time. But the reason they won the debate had more to do with realpolitik. Like, there were Republicans who thought that they could maintain a permanent Republican majority in national politics on the backs of Black voters in the South, because they assumed that as the party that ostensibly freed them, quote unquote, that grateful Black Southerners would basically just vote for them in perpetuity, which is not what ended up happening in any case, but that had to do with other factors. But regardless, that ended up swinging the vote in favor of the radicals. Also, it didn't hurt that radical sentiment in general was ascendant in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. That had to do partly with, just revenge against the South. Lots of people were very angry at the South for starting a war that killed so many people. Again, to reiterate the fact for those of you not familiar with this, the American Civil War killed more Americans, combining both Northern and Southern casualties, than all other American wars combined. If you combine all of the casualties the United States has suffered in all other wars it has fought in, you still would not have as many casualties as was suffered during the Civil War. So the fact that it was just so immensely destructive had people in a very sort of angry mood, at the national level vis-a-vis the South. So that lent radicals a lot more political leverage than they would have had otherwise. But what also helped them is that in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, the Lincoln plan for reconstructing the South involved relatively quick readmission to the Union of Southern states. And Lincoln had relatively mild preconditions for doing that. Basically just a relatively small proportion of white voters in the South had to promise that they had never basically vow loyalty to the Union. And that was enough. And that was already pretty controversial. Lincoln kind of had the political capital to do that because, he was the guy that won the war. So people kind of gave him the benefit of the doubt. But after he was assassinated, the new president did not have that same capital. And that's putting it mildly. For those of you not familiar with this episode in American history, the president after Lincoln was assassinated was the former vice president, a guy named Andrew Johnson. And he was actually from the South. He was actually from, I think, Tennessee. And he had been picked specifically because he was from the South to be vice president in order to try to win votes in border states. And, again, because people in the country were so angry at the South for the Civil War, Andrew Johnson definitely was penalized for being from the South. And it didn't help, too, that he was also for a relatively conciliatory Reconstruction program for Southern states. So between the fact that his program was controversial in the first place and the fact that he did not absolutely at all have the political capital of Lincoln, really supercharged radicalism in the Republican Party in particular, if not the broader electorate. Also relevant here is the fact that the Southern states, after the Civil War, introduced, this is the immediate aftermath, like the first 2 years, immediately after the Civil War ended, the first move of a lot of the new state governments in the South was to introduce what were called black codes. And these were codes that basically went out of their way to restrict the rights of black people in the South, not just their voting rights, like they would do later, but just basic things like freedom of movement, freedom of speech. Like basically every right you could think of was curtailed as part of the black codes. And a lot of them also involved vagrancy laws that effectively required them to work on plantations. So, the outside viewpoint is that the black codes were an effort by the former slaveholding class in the South to try to reestablish the plantation system. They couldn't reestablish slavery, that was made explicitly illegal, but they could reintroduce a kind of de facto form of slavery, which seemed to be what they were trying to do. And that also set off a lot of people in the North, because in their perspective, the whole war was at least partially rationalized and justified in terms of ending slavery. Whether or not the war was really about ending slavery is debatable. It was definitely about slavery, don't get me wrong. This is a hugely contentious debate in the United States even today, whether or not the Civil War was about slavery. It was about slavery, no doubt. But in the minds of Northerners during the war and after the war, whether or not the war itself was about ending slavery, that's actually more debatable. A lot of people thought that the war was more about preserving the Union than it was about ending slavery. Regardless, between wanting to get revenge on the South and seeing slavery as inherently evil, which was more or less a consensus opinion in the North, the fact that white Southerners who had just started a massively destructive war might try to reestablish slavery in spite of all the sacrifices of Northern armies was hugely insulting, or at least was seen as hugely insulting by the broader part of the Northern body politic. And so the response was, again, to further radicalize people in the North. So these three sources of radicalization really boosted radical sentiment and helped out the radical Republicans who wanted to extend citizenship to the freedmen, the former slaves that had been freed after the Civil War. And so that, combined with the realpolitik I mentioned, is the main reason why black Southerners were newly freed Southerners were able to get citizenship after the Civil War. So not really the most idealist sort of genesis of the extension of citizenship. It wasn't quite as lovey-dovey as some of the more favorable histories tend to kind of portray it.
We definitely have a pretty wild history. That's one of the aspects that we've talked a lot about in school and stuff, is a lot of people who haven't really heard the full story or thought about it too much. They'll think like, why are people complaining about racism still? Wasn't slavery overturned and the civil rights movement happened and stuff? And like you said, just because you change a law, you can't change people's minds right away. And whenever those laws are changed, they're going to immediately pivot into how they can maintain the status quo as best they can. And changing the hearts and minds is something that more so changes over generations rather than all at once. Like the youth, the people who are in their early 20s, going back to the poker analogy, they don't really have a huge investment in established ideologies compared to people who are, say, 50 or 60. So they'll oftentimes be passionate about some new idea and really push hard for that, even if their parents disagree with them, because that's one of the things that they're really trying to change in their generation. So we've kind of seen that continually change over time. Yeah, we'll see how the situation in France pans out.
Yeah, the issue of discrimination in European societies, specifically towards immigrants, is kind of a growing issue given the big influx of new immigrants into European societies. So it is a problem that they need to kind of pay attention to, because it's, you know, entirely possible that they could end up with ghettoized communities that are marginalized, and you know, we've seen how that works out here. It's not ideal. It's a very thorny, difficult problem to unravel, especially the longer it festers. So it's important to try to prevent that from happening and try to ensure that people who come to Europe are integrated properly and are extended the opportunities that citizens have to kind of advance their careers, their lives, move up the social ladder, etc. Yeah, it's just an inherently difficult problem when you have like a lot of new people coming in. Every society that gets a big wave of immigrants almost invariably has some degree of social disruption, social unrest, etc. So that's not unusual.
One that immediately comes to mind when you mention that is Sweden's recent wave of immigration.
Yeah.
I think from Syria and the Middle East and stuff. And that's going to be a pretty different culture than Swedish culture. And the amount of people arriving all at once, it was a good gesture of them to be like, hey, there are a bunch of people who need refuge here. And then they take a bunch of people, but the population as a whole maybe wasn't fully on board with that. And it can be kind of messy just for the time period that it takes for the immigrants to learn the customs of the new country that they're in and to kind of be in harmony with them, because they're going to basically live in the way that they have before. Some people who are really compassionate and thoughtful as refugees might be like, hey, how can we be more Swedish and have like an elegant rapport with the people here, when a lot of refugees, they're going to be pretty low on gas anyway because they had to flee their own country. So it's a kind of big ask for them to just suddenly switch and now act like they're Swedish people.
Yeah, we'll see how it works out. You know, in general, the political fallout from that has been a rise of conservatism in French and Swedish politics, especially for far-right parties. So they were pretty conciliatory towards immigration and refugees before, but at this point, that's a very contentious issue. Yeah, they've actually been in the news recently. Did you see that? That is to say, Sweden.
For what?
Burning a Koran.
Oh, yeah. That's why they didn't get the NATO membership, right?
That was actually a different Koran burning.
They burned another Koran? Wow.
Yeah, the issue is not so much that people in Sweden are burning the Koran. The issue in the minds of Turkish leadership, if not leadership in the broader Muslim world, is that the Swedish government keeps giving them permits to do it in public. They want to have protests, and so when you want to have a protest or something in public, you have to get the license or whatever, the permit. from the government. And, the Swedish government knows what these people are, advocating for, know what they're going to do. But just because of freedom of speech, they keep giving them the permits because, they're doing it legally, and it is allowed. But in the minds of, Muslim governments, especially conservative Muslim governments, the Swedish government is acting in a discriminatory way by allowing this sort of open discrimination to happen.
They just got to tell them, guys, don't feel special. The black metal scene in the 90s, they were burning Christian churches, so it's just your turn now. They're just a bunch of disgruntled youths here in Sweden who want to go back to the pagan ways, and they don't like these Abrahamic faiths. And it's not just you, it's also the Christian faith.
Yeah. So unfortunately, that's the newest Karahan burning is probably not going to do them any favors in terms of getting the Turkish government to let them join NATO finally. So we'll see what happens. One would like to think that now that Erdogan has been reelected and there's not going to be another election for a while, would make the Turkish government a little more amelioratory towards Swedish accession to NATO, but you never know. Remains to be seen.
So my opponent said that they're listening to the stream and they're asking, what's the Quran burning? It's the holy text of the Muslim faith. It's like the Bible equivalent.
Yeah.
You have a bunch of fans. I've had 2 people on Ladder today say, hey, your Agent Smith is great. Listening to it. Great stuff.
Oh, cool. Well, that's very kind of them.
Yeah. So if you ever go to a StarCraft event, you're probably going to be more known than you realize. Maybe not by your visual look, but if you ever talk, they'll be like, I've heard that voice before. Who is that?
Ah, I see. I see. Well, I'll keep that in the mind the next time I'm doing an appearance at a convention.
Don't let the fame get to your head, okay?
Yeah, that's important. I'll try, Neuro.
His ego is swelling. Stop this man.
Well, we were talking about immigration, right, and how that's a thing. So going back to France and the recent riots, one of the political implications could be more support for the right wing of French politics. So more specifically, Marine Le Pen and her party, National Rally is what they're calling themselves now. And so that could have, this could bolster their case in the next elections, which aren't too far off now. Kind of remains to be seen, what'll happen between now and then. French politics is, pretty active, so you never know. But, between the earlier protests against Macron, centering around the pension reforms, and now this, kind of seems like National Rally definitely has an advantage heading into the next elections. Because as far as I've seen, the left wing of French politics, specifically the Socialist Party and Le Mélenchon's party, I forget its name, they have not really been able to benefit much, near as I can tell. The polling doesn't seem to suggest that. So it seems like most of the benefit is accruing to the far right, which means that Europe could have another far right government before too long. Italy has the other one right now, Giorgia Meloni. So we'll see. It's a very exciting time in European politics. Lots of movement and change happening.
How's Britain holding up with the whole Brexit thing?
Badly.
Yeah.
I mean, as far as Brexit goes, the impact was not as bad as like the worst prognostications would have suggested. So they kind of got off relatively light in that sense. Maybe that wasn't all that surprising, but in general, it was not like the collapse of the British economy, like some of the chicken hawks were saying. But at the same time, it hasn't been like a boon to the economy either. I think some of the earlier proponents of Brexit have also noted that fact. Although in their case, they have not suggested that the negative economic outcomes are due to Brexit itself, but rather an inability by the British government to take advantage of the opportunities that are provided by Brexit, specifically deregulation and free trade agreements, which have not been forthcoming since the Brexit agreement was agreed to and implemented. I kind of said from the start, way back in 2017, when this was kind of more of a hot topic and we talked about it every other week. I kind of suspected that one of the secret motives for a lot of the pro-Brexit crowd, especially amongst the politicians that were in the pro-Brexit crowd, was that they wanted to use Brexit as an excuse to deregulate the economy and to try to liberalize it, kind of make it more American in a sense. And that was always kind of a pipe dream. Whatever people thought about the European Union and some of the issues there, I never got the impression that translated to a broad-based demand for broader deregulation and liberalization in Britain's economy. So it's not that surprising to me anyway that there's been a failure to kind of move in that direction after Brexit. I think for most people who supported Brexit, if not the broader body politic in general, the sentiment was that Brexit itself would provide economic opportunities, but there would not then be a broader necessity to try to shift government regulations or the way the government was managing the economy. Just leaving the European Union was supposed to provide those opportunities that would generate growth. And now that that has not happened, there is a certain degree of buyer's remorse amongst probably a minority of pro-Brexit voters. Plenty of people are still stubborn about it. There's plenty of people that think still worth it, even if the economic boon isn't there. Some people just voted for it on principle, so for them, it doesn't matter. But yeah, in general, the economy has not really done great. As I've argued before on here, the reason that Britain's economy hasn't been doing well is not really because of Brexit. That's been a factor, but in general, sort of a sluggish economy in Britain has more to do with a long-running trend in Britain that ties into just a lack of productivity growth and a lack of private sector investment. There's just not a lot of growth sectors in the UK that kind of justify and attract broad-based investment in the UK, at least not outside of the financial sector. London and the financial sector there are definitely one of, if not the primary economic driver in the British economy. And that does attract, quite a bit of investment, but that's not enough in and of itself to create prosperity in the broader economy. In order for Britain as a whole, both politically and economically, to do well, there needs to be broader-based economic gains. And that means you need to have private investment in other areas of the UK besides just London. And you also need to see broader-based gains in worker productivity so that you can see gains in wages that translate into more stable and more prosperous workers, such that they can invest in themselves and maybe move up the social ladder, or failing in that, at least invest in their own quality of life, such that they can have better homes, better education for their kids, better stuff, etc. And as is, that just hasn't happened. And it hasn't been happening for several decades. This is a long-running problem in the UK. It's not something that was just recently introduced with Brexit. In fact, you could go so far as to say that it was a contributing factor to Brexit. The lack of economic growth and dynamism in the British economy is part of the reason that people were disgruntled in Britain to the point where they saw a radical step like leaving the European Union as a potentially sufficiently disruptive measure to shake up the political elites such that they would introduce more economic reform, or at least take advantage of opportunities proffered by Brexit such that economic opportunities could be generated in that way. Didn't work, but regardless, it just illustrates the degree of political polarization and discontent that they would do that. And again, that ties into this overarching problem with economic dysfunction in the British economy. Yeah, I think the last inflation reading for the UK was like 9%. So relatively high. Yeah, they're kind of getting hit on all counts.
What is it in US for reference?
I think it dipped under 4% in the most recent reading. So it's been improving. It had been 9%. It peaked at 9% last year. Mm-hmm. So it's been trending down since then. It's still higher than the Fed would like. And I think the Fed is angling for something 2 to 3%. So we're getting closer. We're slowly progressing towards stable inflation. Although I would point out, in case there's any confusion on the part of the listeners, if the Fed does manage to hit its inflation target, that is to say, in other words, if the inflation rate in the United States does fall to a level that the Fed is comfortable enough with to stop increasing interest rates and to basically declare inflation beaten, that does not mean that prices are going to go down. That means most likely that prices are going to roughly stay where they are. So for those of you who are hoping for relief from high prices, you're probably going to be disappointed. It's relatively unusual, historically speaking, according to the data anyway, for prices to fall and reverse price gains from inflation after they have been made. So we're probably stuck with elevated prices for the foreseeable future, even if inflation is defeated. And the only way that you're going to get that purchasing power back is through wage gains. And of course, wage gains have not really been forthcoming in the United States for some decades. For the upper quintile of income earners they've definitely seen wage gains. But if you're just a working class dude, or if you're especially a younger guy who's sort of in the earlier part of his career, when you're in the lower wage earners bracket, you're probably, to use the technical term, screwed for the foreseeable future. So I don't envy you. I'm in the same boat, honestly, given my own income. So we're going to be squeezed for a while on that count, most likely, unless prices could fall if the economy enters recession. But that, of course, comes with its own caveats, of which I'm sure most people are aware. So if you're worried about prices, a recession will resolve that, although you will have to worry about your job at that point, in which case you may have much bigger problems at that point than just high prices.
If prices go down during a recession, what's the downside? Less wages, less jobs?
Yeah, the downside is mass layoffs. So even if prices go down, if you don't have an income, you can't really take advantage of that.
Yeah, if you're making $0, it's not going to be good either way.
Yeah. So that'll definitely put the squeeze on you, and it also makes the recession worse since now you have lower demand in general. Mm-hmm. So there does tend to be a spiral chain reaction there, kind of a unvirtuous cycle, as opposed to a virtuous cycle that comes with economic growth, especially when it stems from technological innovation and productivity growth. That's why it's important for monetary policy and fiscal policy to be counter-cyclical. So, if people are getting laid off and prices are falling and everybody is getting squeezed, it's important then for monetary policy to be expansionary. In other words, for interest rates to fall and for money and loans to be easier to get, since that'll help, generate new economic activity to offset the downturn. And then for fiscal policy also to be expansionary, such that increased government spending can offset the fall in demand somewhat. And the flip side of that is that during economic expansions, monetary policy and fiscal policy should be contractionary. In other words, interest rates should be higher and government spending should fall, so as to not cause the economy to overheat and make a potential overreach on the part of to make sure that economic expansion does not overreach and then generate inflation and then instability that results in a significant downturn or a bubble or what have you. Yeah, the idea of counter-cyclical policy is not popular. During economic downturns, it makes a lot of sense. People are on board with it. But then when you start seeing the economy do well, nobody listens to economists when they say that government should spend less or the monetary policy should be more contractionary. Once the economy starts doing well, people want more spending, more government services, more of that, cheaper loans in order to allow businesses to take advantage of the economic boom. People tend to be very selective about what economic advice from economists they listen to. And unfortunately, the idea of counter-cyclical policy is not one of them that they like to listen to most of the time, specifically during economic expansions. The result being that the downturns tend to be worse. You would not see as much of a run-up in some of the frothy, bubbly type activity in the economy if policy were more contractionary. But as is, nobody listens to us. Never make the mistake that economists are influential. Politicians just kind of do what they want, and then if economic advice from economists happens to correlate with what they want, they'll use that advice as justification to do it. But if we advise the opposite, then they just kind of blow us off. So just don't blame us too much for the shit that goes wrong. Let's see. We covered a lot of ground. How much time do we have left?
Got about half an hour to an hour.
Half an hour to an hour. Okay. How are you holding up? You must be like, what, 10 hours, 12 hours into a stream?
Yep. I'm doing great. We had a massive amount of support right at the start of Agent Smith, so I feel like a champion, to be honest.
Oh, nice.
I also am dressed like William Wallace, which means that if a war were to break out between me and medieval England, I would be in a really good spot to strike fear into their hearts.
Well, let's see. I've got other stuff we can get to, but was there anything you wanted to get to?
I don't think there was anything else that caught my eye in particular. I looked at the news headlines and it made me feel really silly. It's just a bunch of he said, she said bullshit.
Yeah. Well, did we have any questions? I guess I should look at the thing here. See what's what. Let's see, Neuro news. It's not quite. Let me see if I can find it. I always scroll past it a couple times. You have a lot of stuff in your Discord.
Yeah.
There we go. Private biz. Okay, so no questions today.
Yep.
Let's see. I think we did. Do we have a guy named A Colony of Ants in chat today?
Yes.
We do. Okay.
I don't know if they're in chat today, but I recognize them as a Neuro viewer.
Oh, okay. So they actually did ask a question last time that I saw in chat when I was reviewing after the fact. And thank you, by the way, for uploading that. And it's always appreciated.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I should do the usual disclaimer before I forget. It's a little late. I should have done it earlier. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. More painfully obvious at sometimes than others. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. And I do appreciate the feedback I get from chat. I do enjoy seeing the corrections and debates and whatnot. So participation by chat is definitely encouraged in that regard. I don't read chat while we do this generally, so I probably won't see it, but I will go back and review the comments later. So I will see it eventually. So that said, so A Colony of Ants did ask if I could give us a history on Vietnam leading up to the war and how the U.S. managed to normalize relations afterwards. So that's a pretty cool prompt. So I was thinking we might talk about that, in lieu of other topics. So does that sound interesting?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Let's see, Vietnam before the Vietnam War. I won't do like the entire history of Vietnam. I don't know enough about like medieval Vietnam to get into that. And I'm assuming since he referenced the war, he's more interested in like the immediate lead up, sort of like maybe the 100 years or so before the Vietnam War. So we can kind of focus on that. So I guess starting in the late 19th century, Vietnam was one of the later countries to kind of get colonized. The French didn't really get around to it until sort of the 1860s, 1880s, sort of that area. Like a lot of countries that ended up getting colonized, it happened sort of gradually for the most part. It kind of started, the French presence in Indochina started with missionaries. And so French missionaries kind of ingratiated themselves with the court in Vietnam. They became key advisors. They translated documents, all that kind of stuff. And their presence there it provided the French government with a kind of casus belli in cases where they were abused, or at least where the French government alleged that they were abused. and combine that with growing economic influence in the region, and that kind of gave the French a lot of leverage to sway politics in regional government, specifically in the Vietnamese government. And it's important to note that when the French did make Vietnam a colony, they did not like completely just push out the native government. Rather, they just co-opted it. So Vietnam actually maintained its emperor after French colonial rule began, specifically direct French colonial rule. He just didn't have any power. The colonial government monopolized it, but it was not like a completely clean slate once the colonial government did, initiate its operations there. There were a series of wars there, fought against the Vietnamese government. Obviously, the Vietnamese did not hold out too well. Some of them actually did involve China, since technically Vietnam was a tributary state. And actually, one of the Sino-French War. There was a major Sino-French war that broke out in the 1880s that related to the Chinese government trying to provide support to the Vietnamese government as the French government successively fought successive wars in Indochina to expand its authority. And of course, that ended in French victory. And that kind of tied into the broader sort of pressure that Westerners were bringing to bear on China, especially regarding the Opium Wars, which were sort of the broader, conflict that was being fought between the West and China at that time. So you can kind of think as Vietnam as being subsidiary to that broader conflict. But regardless, the end point was the same, French colonial rule over Vietnam. And after they established colonial rule there, they expanded inward towards Thailand and took a couple Thai territories. And they carved that into what is now known as Laos. At the time, it was just basically the province of Laos in French Indochina, but later it became independent. And later they also conquered Cambodia, which I believe had been de facto a part of Thailand as well. So they broke that off and made it another constituent part of French Indochina. So Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, all together comprised French Indochina in Southeast Asia. And they were governed separately at a provincial level, but all of it was governed under a single Indochina colonial government that was controlled from Paris. And, like a lot of territories that were colonized at first, it wasn't that big a deal per se, because most people in societies in that region of the world were still largely rural, largely uneducated, and they didn't really have a sense of nationhood. They had some sense of ethnic identity, Vietnamese speakers and whatnot, but the idea of nationalism, the idea of having pride and a sense of obligation towards your nation, did not yet exist in most societies outside of Europe in the 19th century. That was mostly a European concept that was introduced, somewhat ironically, via colonialism and colonial governments, and more specifically via the educational systems that those colonial governments set up to educate a bureaucratic middle class that could populate the bureaucracies of colonial governments. That middle class ended up being relatively well educated, learned European norms, politics, etc., and in that way was introduced to the idea of nationalism, which they then adopted. And then on that count, they formed nationalist societies, be they secret societies or open societies, and then began advocating for independence. So somewhat counterintuitive sequence of events. You wouldn't think colonial governments would encourage nationalism, and officially they didn't, but just by dint of developing economies and educating local elites, they ended up creating indirectly the kernel, the class of people that would form the kernel of nationalist movements in the early 20th century. In the case of Vietnam.
Do you mean nationalists like where they have pride for the local country or for the colonizing country?
For their own colonized country, not the colonizer. Certainly the French tried to inculcate French identity. In fact, France did more to inculcate affinity and identity with the metropole nation than other colonial powers did. Like Britain didn't really have pretenses to making people British, except for India. They actually did make an effort there. But in places like Africa, for example, or in East Asia, the notion of making people British was not really a primary objective. There was an effort to Christianize them, but making them sort of British in ethnicity or nationality. Not so much that. The French, in contrast, were very proud of their French identity and definitely made it a priority to try to assimilate people that they colonized overseas. And I've seen this cited as one of the reasons that there was so much more of a backlash in the early 20th century to French colonial rule than there was in British colonized territories to British colonial rule. There was a much more earnest and there was a much stronger effort by French colonial authorities to try to dilute, if not replace outright, local identities, and that in turn had a radicalizing effect amongst broad swaths of the population, up to and including the relatively uneducated, politically passive parts of the population, which created fertile ground for some of the more educated and well-resourced middle-class people in colonized societies to try to mass mobilize people into these nationalist movements that were designed to overturn colonial rule and establish independence. So in Vietnam's case, this middle-class kernel was largely Mandarins. Vietnam is culturally heavily influenced by China. It was actually a part of China outright for a long time, and it didn't really end up breaking away until, I think, sort of the late medieval period, when they finally reestablished their independence from Chinese rule. And like in China, they had an emperor, and then they had mandarins, which are basically civil servants. That would roughly be the Western equivalent. For those of you not familiar with Chinese sort of government, they established a professional civil service very early on. Going way back to sort of the Axial Age, right around like 200 BC, is when the Qin emperor, the Qin Empire, Qin dynasty technically, first established a major, professional civil service in China. It wasn't quite the same as it became later. At first, it was largely dominated by, regional elites. So it wasn't quite like the equal opportunity professional service, like we kind of think about it, like it's sometimes framed. It didn't really become that until maybe the Tang dynasty, around 700 AD. And even then, it was mostly children of rich regional elites that kind of dominated it, because the rich regional elites were the ones who were best able to afford education, specifically private tutors and whatnot, who were able to give their children a leg up in the exams, basically, by which people were chosen for the civil service. You had to kind of wait until the Song dynasty, I think, around the year 1000 AD. Well, actually later than that. 1200 to 1300 AD, I think it was. That was roughly the Song dynasty. That's really where you see more the equal opportunity civil service that was more open to everybody, and with people who had more humble backgrounds having relatively more access. So that's kind of where that more came into play. Regardless, China had that model of government very early. And when Vietnam was incorporated into China, that model of governance was extended to Vietnam. So even after they became independent from China, they continued to have that system of an imperial system combined with civil bureaucracy. So that's relevant because the mandarins that populated that bureaucracy formed kind of a natural upper strata in Vietnamese society. Obviously, the emperor and his advisors and the nobility comprised the absolute top of that society, but the upper middle class was largely filled out by those professional bureaucrats, the mandarins. So those guys were still around when the French colonized Vietnam. And when the French started trying to educate people, to fill out the ranks of the colonial government, the mandarins were a logical target because they knew how to read, right? They were literate. Mm-hmm. And also just being well-educated, the parents of, these people had the resources to educate their children anyway. And so they had a basically de facto privileged access to colonial education. Because even if the colonial government didn't provide that education to everybody, the mandarins generally had the resources to find private tutors and whatnot, such that they could still get into the colonial government. So disproportionately, it was mandarins, and the children of mandarins more specifically, that ended up filling out the ranks of the colonial government, and that ended up then being radicalized by not only French policy in colonial Vietnam, but also just by the spread of new information and new ideas, specifically ideas of nationalism and national identity. That proliferated corresponding with the education of Vietnamese elites in Indochina. So, fun fact that kind of underscores this point. The famous Ho Chi Minh, who was the leader of the Vietnamese nationalist movement in the mid 20th century, and was later able to successfully not only beat the French in Vietnam's War of Independence, but well, the French Indochina War, such as it was, and then also led Vietnam for most of its war effort against the United States in the Vietnam War. Ho Chi Minh himself was actually the children of mandarins. So he was not like a humble peasant who, was exposed to the ideas of communism and then joined the party and then rose the ranks and then successfully led the country. He was originally privileged himself. He was from the upper middle class in Vietnam, was educated and was exposed to ideas of communism and nationalism, embraced them, and later became a leader by dint of, privileged access to resources from his middle class background. So that's one of the ironies of a lot of communist leaders and communist movements. A lot of the leadership in those movements actually themselves tend to be pretty bourgeois in terms of background. So Ho Chi Minh is no exception. So that kind of gets you to the early 20th century, right? Colonial rule was established over the course of the late 19th century, and civil bureaucracy and colonial education kind of started up in more the 1880s, 1890s, and then you kind of have to wait until the period from roughly 1900 to 1920 to see the new middle class emerge in those countries out of that colonial educated elite. And it takes about that long for them to start developing a national Vietnamese identity and to start advocating not only advocating for national independence, but also pushing back against some of the more controversial, efforts at assimilation by the colonial French government. Unsurprisingly, demands started out more moderate. Like at first, it was more about moderating French colonial rule and protecting Vietnamese identity in French Indochina. But as the colonial government became less and less flexible and cracked down on increasingly popular nationalist movements in French Indochina, people inherently became radicalized and became more and more revolutionary. So it started out moderate with protests and passive political demands within the rubric of the existing political system. And then as that failed to deliver results, people became revolutionaries. And at first, communism was not the inherent go-to revolutionary group. At first, there actually was a non-communist nationalist movement that was largely dominant in French Indochina, specifically in French Vietnam. And over the course of the 1920s and 30s, they became more active, more radical, more violent. And what happened is that in the 1930s, there was a big operation by the French colonial government in Indochina, and again, in Vietnam specifically, to crack down on that nationalist movement. And that effort was actually very successful. They were able to find these people, to unwind their networks, and to basically crush the nationalist movement. And the hope on the part of the French is that this would serve to push people towards assimilation, make them more French, and would basically just put Vietnam back on the track of being an integral part of the French metropole. And instead, what it did is create a vacuum that was filled by communism. This is also not an uncommon phenomena. You can see that in Russia, for example, where the revolution that overthrew the Tsar was not actually communist, it was actually nationalist, by and large. It definitely included left-wing radical groups like the communists and the Bolsheviks, but it was a broad-based movement. It was very popular. That was called the February Revolution. So the new government was called the Kerensky government, after the leader that sort of took charge in the wake of the Tsar's resignation. And his failure to pull Russia out of the war and deal with hyperinflation, food shortages, continued defeats at the front, all of that made him just as popular as the Tsar had been. And the result was a political vacuum that was, again, filled by communists, and in this case, specifically by Bolsheviks. There's a similar phenomenon in Cuba. The Batista government was an authoritarian government that ruled Cuba over the course of the 1940s, 1950s, or at least most of the 1940s and 50s. And he was very successful in crushing the nationalist revolutionary movement that emerged to try to restore democracy in Cuba. And the result was not a successful end to insurgent activity in Cuba. Rather, it was the expansion of communist sentiment and popularity in the Cuban revolutionary movement. Fidel Castro basically became the de facto default leader of the movement once all of the other non-communist elements in the movement had been eliminated by the Batista government. And of course, we all know how that ended for Batista in Cuba. Obviously the communists were able to make great use of that and become the new power in Cuba. So, this ability to crack down on nationalists in the early mid 20th century rarely had the desired impact. Mostly it just empowered the communists. So Vietnam was no exception, and the result is an empowered communist movement in Vietnam that then attracted lots of new, recruits. They were the ones who were leading the movement at that point, and they were the logical choice for any entrepreneuring Vietnamese nationalist who was looking to get involved in the independence movement. Now, it might have been that the non-communist nationalist movement would have had time to kind of reconstitute itself, but alas, World War II happened, and that really threw a wrench in everybody's plans. World War II was immensely destructive, and it fucked up a lot of agendas all over the world, and Vietnam, another perfect case in point. So the French were really hoping, after crushing the nationalist movement, that things would settle down. Instead, they got communism and a Japanese invasion. Well, maybe not an invasion per se, but de facto Japanese occupation, followed by annexation. The only reason Japan got Indochina back after the war is because Japan lost. If not for that, they would have lost the territory invariably. So one of the impacts of Japanese occupation, de facto at first and then later de jure, was a rather unpopular Japanese puppet government in Indochina. One of the things that the Japanese war effort needed was food and labor. And so what ended up happening over the course of the war is increasingly severe confiscations of food in occupied territories, as well as forced labor in order to meet the labor demand. And, food shortages and then forced labor, which was quite brutal. Many people who were forced to labor for the imperial Japanese government ended up dying because of overwork. Between the forced labor and the food shortages, the Japanese were very, very unpopular in the territories that they ended up occupying. And French Indochina, again, no different. So the result is that the nationalist movement in Indochina was supercharged. After the French were kicked out, that created a vacuum. So now the independence forces were able to increase the tempo of their operations. And again, the main institution that was pushing for independence at that point was the communists. So they were able to take advantage of that and gain further momentum. Once the Japanese started getting unpopular and people started more actively fighting against the Japanese puppet government, that further lent popularity to the communists, and that further supercharged their movement. Now, I would take a moment here to point out that the entire nationalist independence movement in Vietnam was not all communist. Communists were the largest of a myriad of different movements that were happening at the same time. Well, I should say a myriad of different groups that were all operating at the same time. And what the communists did is coalesce all of those different groups under one umbrella organization that was called the Viet Minh. And I'll talk more about them later, but the Viet Minh became the preeminent nationalist independence group in Vietnamese politics in this period, in the mid-20th century. So invariably, they were the main group, but they did not paint themselves as explicitly communists. Rather, they painted themselves as nationalists. The fact that the Communist Party was the largest group within them was controversial at times, but was otherwise ignored in order to kind of keep the focus on the main enemy, that being the French. So when I talk about the communists being the main group here, that's not to say that they were the only group. They had not yet pushed out and eliminated all of the rival groups at that point. They were still trying to build a coalition revolutionary movement that could unite everybody against the common foe. So the Viet Minh really gained a lot of support over the course of the Japanese occupation. And their operations were, ironically, encouraged vastly by special operations forces working for the United States government, specifically the OSS, which was basically the predecessor to the CIA in the United States. A number of operatives working for that group were sent to Indochina specifically to provide support, advice, and leadership to the revolutionaries that were operating in the Indochinese territory operating against the Japanese. So the Vietnamese, the same people the United States fought so hard against later, were actually receiving American support during World War II. Just one of those little ironies of history. So eventually World War II ends. The United States never invaded Indochina, so it remained occupied right up until the end of the war. And of course, once the Japanese leave, there's a vacuum, right? The French haven't come back yet, but the Japanese are gone. And that gives the nationalist forces in Indochina an immense vacuum that they immediately fill. And they attempt to declare independence, but doesn't work. Nobody's quite ready for that. International politics are not ready to just allow European colonies, wherever they are, to just arbitrarily declare independence. So the United States is sympathetic, but it also doesn't want to aggravate France in the immediate aftermath of the war. And so the foreign policy at the time on the part of France, Britain, and the United States is to try to return former European colonies to their former owners. So Indonesia is returned to the Dutch, French Indochina is returned to the French, etc. And this was very controversial, but again, the United States kind of saw itself as an equal partner still, more or less, of the British and French. Obviously, we were senior partners in the terms of power, and we generally got our way as far as overarching policy. But one of the concessions we had to make to our allies was that they would get their colonies back. So we were more or less on board with that. The Atlantic Charter technically obligated them to grant independence eventually, and they did sign on to that. So that was sort of the excuse. We're going to give you the colonies back, but we're going to hold you to this promise to eventually give them independence. That was sort of how American foreign policy shaped out in the immediate aftermath of World War II. So the French come back. Well, actually, hold on. There's actually one more interesting bit of trivia here. So the Viet Minh nominally take control of French Indochina. They try to set up their own government, and nominally they are in control at one point. But what happens is that the first foreign troops to come back to reestablish control are not actually French. They're actually Chinese. And more specifically, they're Chiang Kai-shek's troops. The government in control of China at that time was still Kuomintang. And they were also nominally, technically, an equal partner to the United States in the war effort. Not really in practice, but diplomatically, they were an equal partner. And, the vision that the United States had for the post-war world order was one in which different powers had responsibility for maintaining order in different regions. So Russia was going to be responsible for Eastern Europe and, its periphery. Britain and France would be responsible for their respective empires and their spheres of influence. The United States would be responsible for the Western Hemisphere. And then China would be responsible for East Asia and Southeast Asia. At least that was nominally the long-term vision. And so probably the only significant manifestation of that vision in the immediate post-war effort, at least in so much as it involved China, was that Chinese troops were entrusted with the occupation and maintenance of order, quote unquote, in French Indochina after the Japanese troops had left. And so the result, somewhat interestingly, is that northern Vietnam was occupied by Chinese troops for the first time in several centuries. And another fun fact for you, Vietnamese nationalists do not look at China, or certainly Chinese governments, any more favorably than they do to European governments, especially in this period when Vietnamese nationalism is sort of peaking, in so much as it's becoming much more popular in Vietnam. France, obviously their main target, but then China is also a kind of historical enemy of Vietnam. Again, Vietnam was incorporated for a very long time in China, and it took a big war in order to reestablish independence. So, China as an antagonist in Vietnamese history is not an uncommon role for China, historically speaking. So when Chinese troops roll in, the Viet Minh are not happy about that. They don't see them as like fellow Asians who are kind of struggling against European imperialists. They're seen as imperialists in their own right. So the Viet Minh kind of try to resist it, but there's not really much they can do either. And they don't really know what they can do at this point. They don't want to trade French colonialism for Chinese colonialism. So they kind of bide their time and try to lobby the United States in particular, as well as the West in general, to try to get not only the Chinese troops out, but also the French out. But that comes to nothing. Ultimately, the colony is handed back to France. The Chinese troops leave, the French troops come back. And at that point, the French make it very apparent that they have no intention of giving any concessions to the Viet Minh, even in spite of the fact that they very obviously have garnished an immense amount of support in Vietnam and built up a self-sustaining working government in the northern part of Vietnam that is in de facto control of broad swaths of the country. So the result, unsurprisingly, is war, specifically the Indochina War. And so this is where the Viet Minh take up arms and full-on start an active revolution against the colonial government in Indochina. And I would point out here, too, that it's not just the Vietnamese that are doing this, it's also the Cambodians and the Laotians. French Indochina in general is rallying behind the Viet Minh in their effort to overthrow the French government. So this is not a Vietnamese thing, it's a broad-based Indochina thing, which is why they call it the Indochina War. So the war drags out, as you can imagine. The French are not like in the best state after World War II. Obviously, there was an immense amount of destruction. The French don't really have the money to like wage a full-on counterinsurgency in Indochina. And the Viet Minh have gotten a lot more powerful, so they're able to significantly challenge colonial authority all over the territory. They can't quite beat French colonial forces in open battle yet, but they can definitely deny them active control of the country. It turns into a classic insurgency. Well, not even that, a classic guerrilla war. Now, the United States has mixed feelings about this. In general, sentiment in the body politic in the United States is sympathetic to the colonized people. But at the same time, the Cold War is starting up. And there's a sense that the United States needs to maintain good relations with France in order to, well, not only ensure that the French government maintains its legitimacy and support, because the main trend in French politics in the immediate aftermath of World War II was communism ascendant. After the war, there was a lot of very hungry people out of work, and communism seemed like an obvious solution. Combine that with a lot of angry anti-conservative sentiment as a result of, the occupation, the Bataan government, et cetera. And, leftist politics was very clearly ascendant. So the United States government wanted to try to prop up the non-communist French government as much as possible. And, forcing them to give up colonies was not seen as helpful in that sense. So even though the United States government kind of wanted to end colonialism, we didn't want to do it in a way, and certainly not at a time, when it could have resulted in the broad-based loss of popularity and legitimacy for a nationalist government that could then spiral out and result in a communist government that would align with the Soviet Union. That was considered the more negative outcome than the maintenance of colonial governance in Indochina, or other territories. And so the result is that the United States government ended up supporting the French war effort in Indochina. At first, it was not direct. At first, it was just mostly, at least, in the form of money. So something like half of the cost of the war effort, specifically, again, France's war effort in the Indochina War, was actually paid for by the United States government. So we were involved in this effort by the Vietnamese to overthrow foreign rule and establish full unmitigated independence from very early, from at least the 1950s, the early 1950s even. Again, not directly involved at first, more indirectly involved in so much as we were providing money. But still, the French war effort would not have been sustainable in any way without that. So, we definitely had a role to play there. We were definitely implicated in colonial governance there. So again, the war rages for a while. The French cannot really hold their own. They can win all the battles, but they're clearly losing the war. And ultimately, the penultimate moment in the war is the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. And, those of you who have studied the Vietnam War already know all about this. But for those of you who have not, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu is considered the decisive battle of the Indochina War. So, in this battle, the French basically overextended. They deployed to a base deep into Indochina, well away from roads or any other connection, to the coast where the French control was the strongest. And their hope was that they could draw the insurgents into an open battle that they figured that they could win. Because again, being a conventional army, they could generally win all the battles against the insurgents. But the insurgents, knowing that, tended to avoid open battle, preferring to focus on softer targets and to use hit-and-run tactics to try to bleed the French colonial government over time. So that was the focus, but the French really wanted to try to end the war decisively with a big conventional battle, and so they tried to draw them into it by deploying way out into this obscure area called Dien Bien Phu. And they fortified it. It was basically an air base surrounded by hills that had fortified positions on top of them. And so the hope is that they would attract attention, and they did. It was very successful in that sense. What they weren't counting on is the degree of force that the Viet Minh could bring to bear, because all through the war they had been mobilizing the countryside. Again, most of the population was rural, farmers. They were not like well-educated, well-resourced middle-class people. And because the countryside was largely uneducated and was not really familiar with nationalist concepts of fighting for your country, fighting against foreign rule and whatnot, it really fell to the middle class, specifically the middle class nationalists, to go into the countryside and radicalize these people. Basically they went out to them, gave them a political education, taught them about all the bad things that the French colonial government was responsible for, taught them that the Viet Minh was trying to fight against them, and to teach them national identity, to give them a sense of Vietnamness that could link them to the other people in the country, and to give them a sense of hope, and also to give them a bunch of promises, basically to promise that once they had taken control, that they would help them, give them subsidies, make their lives better, et cetera. Political bullshit, typical political bullshit of one kind or another that you would expect. So that effort was very successful, and over the course of Viet Minh's activities in the countryside to try to mobilize the populace, by the time the French were deploying to Dien Bien Phu, they had significantly, that is to say the Viet Minh, had significantly increased the number of people that they had under arms, ready to fight for them. And this became readily apparent over the course of the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, because the Viet Minh completely surrounded the airbase and laid siege to it. And, maybe that wouldn't have necessarily been a problem for the French, but the issue is that the Viet Minh had also managed to get a hold of artillery, most likely from the Soviets, but, also possibly from other sources. And, the French, for their part, weren't too worried about it. They kind of knew that they had some artillery, but they assumed that the terrain around Dien Bien Phu was too rugged for the Viet Minh to lug major artillery pieces into range to attack the airbase. They were wrong. As it happens, the terrain was indeed extremely rugged, but the Viet Minh were very capable in terms of their ability to navigate that terrain, even to the point of clearing terrain and using mass labor, just huge numbers of laborers to use ropes and pulleys and whatnot to literally just pull these very large artillery pieces up rugged terrain and place them on the top of, hills, cliffs, what have you, such that they could just pound this airbase from a distance. So, right away, one of the key French assumptions about the upcoming battle was proven false, like very clearly. The Viet Minh had numbers, they had the ability to use large artillery and to put significant pressure, both in terms of infantry attacks and in terms of ranged fires on their base. Now, the French at this point were not perturbed by this. They assumed that even as increasing numbers of Viet Minh attacked the base, that they would be able to hold out so long as they could retain air supply. They brought in not only ammunition, food, what have you, but also new replacements to replace losses. So it seemed like, to the French mind anyway at the time, that they could just hold out, and if they could do so, that they could kill significant amounts of Viet Minh to the point that they could perhaps cripple the insurgency and reestablish control over French Indochina. And, as history showed subsequently, and they were wrong about that too, the attrition of the battle was immense. Obviously, the Vietnamese and, other groups, the Viet Minh, took much greater losses, but they could replace them, and they could replace them readily. So the pressure just never let up. There was never a point when the French could inflict a number of casualties that could ease the pressure on them. And in the meantime, they were suffering significant attrition that was, over time, reducing their ability to successfully defend the base from successive waves of infantry attacks. And, I'm giving you like the Cliff Notes version of the battle. I'm not super familiar with the details, but eventually the base was just overrun. Like there just came a point where they were no longer capable of sustaining the losses they were, or maintain the level of resupply that was necessary to hold Dien Bien Phu. and more specifically the air base around which the French fortifications were centered. One by one, the French fortifications around the air base fell, and eventually the air base itself was stormed and successfully taken by the Viet Minh. And this really broke the back of the French position in Indochina. Up till this point, their colonial army had successfully been able to put out fires wherever they popped up, even if they were not able to stop them from popping up in the first place. But after this battle, the colonial army suffered a significant defeat, and they didn't have nearly enough troops to continue putting out fires like they had before. And the result is that the French government was forced to the negotiating table and had virtually no choice but to negotiate what came to be called the Treaty of Paris, in which the Viet Minh negotiated terms of independence for the better part of French Indochina from the French. So that takes you up to, I think, 1954, 55. I don't quite remember when the Treaty of Paris was. But basically, the terms of the treaty involved independence for Laos, Cambodia, North Vietnam, and kind of sort of independence for South Vietnam. This is where the partition of Vietnam into two countries initially happened. The French were not willing to concede South Vietnam to the Viet Minh. The French control and influence over South Vietnam was much stronger, like the rubber plantations, for example, that comprised the dominant economic activity in South Vietnam were largely French-owned at that time, or where they were not French-owned, were owned by local Vietnamese that were loyal to the French. Also, South Vietnam had actually been the first part of Vietnam that had been colonized by the French, so they had a much stronger history and much stronger presence in South Vietnam than they'd had in North Vietnam. For the record, South Vietnam was referred to by the French as Cochin China. Some trivia for you, basically. But if you see that in a history book or something, don't be confused. That's basically just the French term for South Vietnam. So the French, also, it's worth mentioning that the Viet Minh victory over French forces in Vietnam after during and after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu was not so crushing that the French did not retain leverage, and so they leveraged. They used that leverage rather in order to retain Cochin China as part of the Treaty of Paris. Also, I would elaborate when I say retain South Vietnam. I'm not saying they maintained like a colonial government there. Even South Vietnam got a new independent government that was not controlled directly by the French government. But the government that was set up did retain close ties to France, and it was seen as being heavily influenced by France. So that's part of the reason that government went on to be very unpopular in the South. It was not seen as having legitimacy amongst Vietnamese nationalists. And of course, if you're a Vietnamese nationalist in the North, you do not see the Treaty of Paris as being an endpoint for the struggle. You want, as a Vietnamese nationalist, the liberation of all Vietnamese territory, up to and including that is in what is now a separate South Vietnamese republic. So right from the start, even after the Treaty of Paris had been signed, the North Vietnamese, and more specifically the Viet Minh, had no intention of stopping the struggle to unify Vietnam and create a fully independent Vietnamese state. So the Treaty of Paris was more just a break in the fighting than it was a endpoint, for the conflict. So that's the Treaty of Paris. That gets you into the late 1950s. So at this point, the United States is relatively satisfied with the outcome. French colonial rule is over, so that's not great for France, but we were not willing to go to bat for them and try to use the American military to maintain French colonial rule. We were willing to pay for it. We were willing to pay for the French war effort, but we were not going to do it for them. So the erection of independent states in French Indochina was to the better, as far as the American government was concerned. French colonial rule was not seen as legitimate nor sustainable. So it was hoped that even though the Viet Minh had taken control of North Vietnam, and obviously they were more communist aligned, especially as far as foreign relations went. So that was kind of a net loss as far as the Cold War competition with the Soviet Union. But Laos, Cambodia, and South Vietnam were not communist, and so that comprised a natural bulwark in Washington's mind. Or at least among minds in Washington, rather, as far as Cold War confrontation. So naturally, the United States then set up relations with South Vietnam and started supporting them in the hopes that they would be able to comprise that bulwark against communism. However, the problem that they encountered, that I kind of referenced before, is that the South Vietnamese government was not seen as legitimate by Vietnamese nationalists in South Vietnam. And the result was a growing unrest in South Vietnam that the South Vietnamese government had an increasing difficulty putting down. It didn't help that Diem, the dictator of South Vietnam, was very bad at politics. That's kind of the polite way of putting it.
How is he bad? How is he bad at it?
Okay, so to kind of explain this, you kind of have to look at some of the demographics of Vietnam. When I say Vietnam here, I mean both North Vietnam and South Vietnam. So one of the impacts of French colonial rule in Vietnam, and this is something that actually predated colonial rule, Christianization, or rather Christian proselytizing in Indochina writ large, resulted in a relatively large minority of Catholics in what had been a predominantly Buddhist region. And these Catholics, even if they were Vietnamese nationalists, did not like communism. That's a consistent Catholic thing all over the world, whatever culture or country you're talking about. Like, Catholics do not like communism.
Why not?
The atheism of communism is abhorrent to all religious people, generally.
Yeah, I remember that now. Yeah.
But Catholics in particular take that very seriously.
Well, because they already have their own established religious hierarchy.
Yeah, that's part of it.
That's what communist governments do, is they put the state above the church. And church does not like that. That makes sense.
Yeah, to a degree, you could tie it into that tension between Republicans and the Catholic Church that I mentioned earlier when we were talking about France. So, in the minds of Catholic conservatives, communism was just the latest iteration of their traditional rivals, the Republicans. Just even more radical and extreme and violent. And, South Vietnamese Catholics were not really fully assimilated into the French identity such that they necessarily inherited that. But in so much as French political culture influenced Vietnamese political culture, you could say there's some connection there that may have influenced their view. Regardless, Catholics in South Vietnam, Vietnam generally, did not trust the communists that were in the Viet Minh. And in so much as the communists were seen as in control of the Viet Minh, the result is that a significant number of Catholics that had been in North Vietnam migrated to South Vietnam and became the main constituency in South Vietnam that fought against the communists. Now, that's not to say that South Vietnam did not have its own Catholics, and a number of the elites in South Vietnamese society, the middle-class professionals, the business owners, etc., were themselves Catholic. And that got to be a problem because Diem, the guy who became the new president of the newly independent South Vietnam, was also himself Catholic. Now, again, there's not necessarily tension between being Catholic and being a Vietnamese nationalist. In fact, the new government of South Vietnam went out of its way to try to bolster its nationalist credentials in order to build legitimacy. And like I mentioned before, there were lots of independence groups in Vietnam that were a part of the Viet Minh that were not themselves communist. So, the idea of a non-communist nationalist or even Catholic nationalist, that existed. That was not shocking. The problem was that Diem was a chauvinist. It was not enough in his mind for Vietnam to have a nationalist government. In his mind, it needed to also be Catholic. The Catholic religion needed to be primary and to be state-supported in his government. And, while there was a sizable Catholic minority in South Vietnam, especially after all the migrants from North Vietnam, it was still a majority Buddhist country. And if you're a government that's really struggling with legitimacy already, religiously oppressing the majority of people in your country, in other words, the adherence of a faith that is followed by a majority of people in your country, that's a preternaturally dumb move politically. Like, don't do that. That is politics 101. But he refused to listen to advice to the contrary, right? He refused to listen to advice saying, don't do that. Don't oppress the Buddhists. He did it anyway. And he also failed to listen to advice from the CIA, telling him not to rig the election that was held after the Treaty of Paris in South Vietnam too obviously. There was a transition period after the Treaty of Paris when the South Vietnamese government was basically just the previous colonial government, but without elections. They didn't hold elections right away. They said that they were going to hold them like a year or two after the treaty was implemented. So when those elections came, the CIA knew that Diem, being a dictator, was going to rig the election. So they told him, make sure the result is believable. Make sure you don't win by like 99%. because it's patently obvious that you do not have the support of 99% of the population. There's an insurgency, there's unrest, there's protests. Like, your rule is controversial. So we know you're going to, quote unquote, win the election, but just have the result reflect some of that dissent so you can have at least some legitimacy, so that your democratic mandate can actually have some legitimacy. So what does he do? He wins by 99%. He just totally blows them off and rigs the election in the most obvious way possible. So, no one is in any doubt that Diem is a dictator, that he's oppressing the majority of that he's oppressing Buddhists, the most populous religious group in the country, and is otherwise just being like a shit governor. Like, he's just bad at the job of being president. And at that point, it was very clear that South Vietnam's government would not be able to be any kind of bulwark against the Viet Minh, in other words, the communists, with Diem in power. Like, it was not going to happen. And nationalist elements within the South Vietnamese military really were aware of that fact and started plotting a coup. And they approached the American government, and more specifically the CIA, and basically asked them what we would do if they did propagate that coup. And the American response was to kind of waffle on it. The Kennedy administration, Kennedy was president at the time, they were not really super gung-ho about it, but it was obvious that they didn't have a lot of choice as far as, Diem. So they tacitly gave their okay. They did not fully endorse it per se. For example, one of the caveats, one of the conditions that the Kennedy administration had is that they were not supposed to kill Diem. They were supposed to just overthrow the government and then exile Diem. And so, they were on board with the coup for the most part, but they had caveats. And they were a little surprised and disappointed when they ended up killing Diem anyway. It's one thing to have puppet governments that, are supported by the Americans and the CIA and whatnot. But the degree of control that the CIA has over those people is frequently oversold. Generally, cooperation between governments that align with the United States and the CIA tends to be on a relatively more equal footing than people kind of think. Generally, these people are people who are going to do what they want regardless of what the U.S. wants, and try to enlist the CIA as a kind of a force multiplier, which is not to say that the CIA is completely absolved of, the activity of these people. As a force multiplier, obviously they're culpable. And sometimes the actors that were supported by the CIA probably did things that they would not have done in the absence of CIA support. Although that's kind of getting into murky territory. It's kind of hard to debate it given that we don't have full access to the relevant information. But regardless, the CIA was involved in the coup in so much as it tacitly gave permission and refused, neglected, shall we say, to inform Diem that, yes, his military was in fact about to overthrow his government. So, the United States government played dumb and pretended not to see anything. And then when the coup happened and Diem was assassinated, we pretty much immediately recognized the new military government of South Vietnam. So the new military government was much less dumb about politics. They stopped the oppression of the Buddhist and otherwise tried to refocus effort on development as well as undoing the unpopular policies of the previous Diem government. And at this point, the insurgency the insurgency has been building steadily over time. That was one of the reasons that Diem didn't have any, that was one of the reasons the US government didn't have any faith in Diem. It was very obvious that his counterinsurgency efforts were not producing results and that the insurgency was just getting closer and closer to a success. So after the coup, the United States government doubled down on support to the new military government. We had renewed faith in the new leadership, and we started sending more financial aid, more advisors, more military equipment, et cetera, all that kind of stuff. We were already doing that under the Diem government, but much less so. We had advisors and whatnot in place, and we were sending other forms of aid. But we pick it up after the coup happens in order to try to maximize the probability that the new government would be able to cement its control over the country and establish South Vietnam as an explicitly anti-communist outpost. Didn't work. The new government was more successful at winning hearts and minds, as the phrase goes, but it was not enough to stem the tide of anti-government sentiment in South Vietnam. And it didn't help that South Vietnam from the start was immensely corrupt. So, the Viet Minh had their own problems with corruption, but, they were so much better at mobilizing people at the ground level, at the grassroots level, that the corruption of South Vietnam was much easier what was much more known, widely known, because of information operations by the Viet Minh than any equivalent corruption or abuses that were happening under the Viet Minh government in North Vietnam. So that was a big advantage right there. The South Vietnamese government just had a very hard time counteracting that. And, again, the abuses and corruption of the South Vietnamese government were very clear to see, right? It's not as though the Viet Minh were lying about the corruption and abuses happening. Like, it was definitely happening. And the South Vietnamese government never really got better on that count. Part of the problem is that elites in South Vietnam, and this is a recurring problem. Those of you who maybe fought in Iraq or Afghanistan may find this disturbingly familiar, but the reality is that America's allies, the elites of South Vietnamese society, assumed that support from the United States would always be there, and that because that was the case, they didn't need to try too hard. They knew that their government was not popular with the public, but they assumed that so long as they had military support from the United States, that there was nothing that would really change, that their government would be able to hold on indefinitely. And so the result is that they did not feel particularly compelled to actually become less corrupt or become better at governance, or to otherwise take steps, like even just logical, obvious steps, to build the legitimacy of their government. So that fact also just kind of doomed the South Vietnamese government as far as legitimacy, and ultimately kind of sealed its fate. The Viet Minh, as a result, always had a ready constituency that was willing to listen to them, believe them, and join their cause over the course of their war effort in South Vietnam. I would point out that technically it wasn't the Viet Minh operating in South Vietnam. Technically it was the Viet Cong, which was ostensibly a popular revolutionary group that was started by local South Vietnamese in order to overthrow their popular government. But of course, in point of fact, it was supported by the Viet Minh secretly. Everybody kind of knew that even at the time, and was basically just the Viet Minh's front within South Vietnam, which is why you hear the term VC a lot when you hear, well, I guess not so many Vietnam War veterans now in the United States, but when you listen to them talk about the war, they would refer to the VC, so that's the Viet Cong. So the Viet Cong became, an increasingly potent force in its guerrilla war against the South Vietnamese government, which, really struggled as the Viet Cong gained popularity. And the result ultimately is that the United States had to intervene directly in order to help, the Vietnamese government there. And I guess the question was, what was the history leading up to the Vietnam War? And 1965 is when the first American troops deployed formally to South Vietnam in something other than an advisory capacity. So, I won't get too much into that. That's kind of beyond the scope of the question, but I think that pretty much gives you an idea of what was happening in Vietnam in the lead up to the Vietnam War.
Nice, well done. Clap.
So I don't know if Colony of Ants is here listening, but that is more or less my best crack at his question there, or his request rather.
We did get 2 questions as well that I put in the Agents channel.
Let's see that. How do I think that AI and automation will influence the current phase of inflation medium term, let's say 10 to 20 years from now? 10 to 20 years is a long time to forecast. That's a long way out. Forecasting is very difficult to do, even over the course of just a couple of years, especially with the world as chaotic as it is right now. There's so many new technologies. The economy is, we don't really know we don't fully know the properties of how the economy, either in the United States or in the world economy, really behaves at this point, because it's evolved so much, so rapidly over the past couple decades. So it's just really hard to predict things in general right now, let alone 10, 20 years in the future. That's really tough. As far as the impact on inflation of AI and automation, probably relatively limited in the short term. There's certainly adoption happening of AI technology that's, disrupting established industries, but it's going to probably take a while for it to really reach its full potential and for that disruption to kind of peak to the point where it becomes like noticeably disruptive. For now, it's kind of peripheral, and probably, I would guess, would remain so for a couple of years. The technology is still pretty rudimentary, right? It can do some cool stuff, but it's not yet at the point where it's like really revolutionizing broad swaths of the economy it's still got a ways to go on that count.
I can write an undergrad essay, but I can't take over the world yet.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, even in those industries where it's going to have radical effects, I don't know that those radical effects will translate to lower prices or perhaps higher prices over the long term. Presumably it would have a deflationary effect. Presumably, because you can do stuff more efficiently, that generally means that prices will be lower because your cost of production is lower. Therefore, prices follow. But I don't know if that's what's going to happen. It could be that the markets that are most, I should say, yeah, the markets is the right word. The markets that are going to be the most impacted by AI may be relatively centralized to the point where the few dominant firms in those industries basically retain the gains from artificial intelligence. So you don't necessarily see lower prices there, but you may see larger profit margins in the cases where there's industries with market concentration. I don't know enough about the industries where artificial intelligence is likely to be the most impactful, or even all of the industries where it would even be relevant. That would require a much larger, grander study by a professional economist than I have done or am likely to do. I doubt anybody knows the answer on that count anyway. So in general, I would expect the effect to be deflationary, but it's not inevitable. It kind of depends more on market forces and individual industries. That remains to be seen. But I would point out that the number of industries that will be affected and the scale of the industries that will be affected, regardless of market concentration, may not be sufficiently large and impactful to the overall economy to have a significant, noticeable impact on inflation one way or the other. So in that sense, the answer could well be nothing. Even if it is very disruptive in a few industries, it may not translate to broader economic impact that is noticeable in prices. But again, that remains to be seen. The technology is still new. It could have significantly disruptive, revolutionary effects down the road as the technology improves and as new uses are found in ever broader segments of the overarching economy. So that's a really fancy way of saying, I don't know. I can't really tell. It's anybody's guess right now. But in my defense, that really should be the answer of anybody, even the most informed of commentators on this question. So let's see, there's that. And the other question was, how do I see inflation acting on the shaky harvest because of poor conditions nearly planet-wide? Will inflation already account for cover price hikes, or could prices go up further? How long before they come down? When the next good harvest is delivered, or X month beyond that? Yeah, so this is a question for an agricultural economist, which I am not. Pre-existing inflation does not negate inflationary forces. So the fact that there's already inflation does not mean that bad harvests are not going to then push prices up further. So I would say that if there are planet-wide bad harvests, then yes, prices will go up even further than they already have. Current inflation has not accounted for that. I guess maybe you're talking about futures markets. Futures markets can account for expected inflation and drive up prices that way. But I don't know the degree to which futures markets have accounted for bad weather recently, certainly not planet-wide. So probably I would expect further inflation if there is, in fact, further bad harvest planet-wide. Most likely that's going to be the impact. Let's see. I don't know yet if bad harvests planet-wide are going to be sufficient to drive significant inflation, however. Even if significant agricultural regions of the planet are suffering from, say, drought or other bad conditions, that does not necessarily mean that the shortfall subsequent is going to be so large as to cause, say, mass famine or just massive inflation in agricultural goods. What generally happens is that when one agriculturally productive region suffers bad weather or what have you, just has a bad harvest, then another agriculturally productive region will take note of that fact and will plant more, will basically produce more in expectation of that, in expectation of both higher prices and of the shortfall. People basically taking advantage of the gap in the market to try to win over market share and get a little windfall. So generally, historically speaking, there's been enough agriculturally productive regions unaffected by bad harvests that extra planting, excess production in those regions has been able to offset and negate shortfalls in production in other regions that are experiencing bad times. Certainly, the weather around the world has been getting more erratic. So you have seen more regions of the world, agriculturally productive regions of the world, suffering from those weather-related issues of one kind or another. But that does not yet mean inherently that agriculturally productive regions in other parts of the world will not be able to make up that shortfall. I'm not sufficiently familiar with the sort of balance between those regions right now to be able to tell you whether they will be able to do that. I would point out, though, that it's not just that other agriculturally productive regions can produce more in order to offset shortfalls in other regions. It's also the case that as prices get higher, what happens is agriculturally unproductive regions also start producing in order to offset the shortfall. Because what happens is that regions that are not very productive are generally not competitive when prices are low. The cost of production in agriculturally uncompetitive regions is relatively high, and so those producers get pushed out of the market when prices fall. But during inflationary periods, when global prices are very high, prices rise above their cost of production, and then those agriculturally unproductive lands are brought back into the market and start producing again. And the nice thing about those lands is that even though they can't produce as efficiently or productively as other regions, they can help offset significant shortages in productive areas. And the amount of borderline land that is not very productive but that can be brought back into the market in the event of high prices is pretty significant. There's a lot of land that can be used like that is generally not used. So that should help significantly in the case of broad-based crop failures in some of the more agriculturally productive regions. Even in the case where broad regions of the planet are struggling, we should have enough leeway. That is to say, we should have enough excess capacity in the agricultural productive regions combined with new capacity being brought online in the border, the unproductive lands that can be brought into the market to keep price and free to keep inflation in the agricultural markets worldwide moderate. They're still going to be high. Between energy disruption, the war in Ukraine, between high interest rates, between debt crises and crises in the developing world, there's a lot of inflationary prices right now in agricultural markets, in global agricultural markets. So there's going to be inflation, but hopefully market activity will offset that and keep it from spiraling out of control and resulting in just, again, mass famine, among other disruptive factors. So that would be my expectation. How long before prices come down? No idea. It totally depends on a bunch of random factors that nobody can realistically predict. I know I've been saying I don't know a lot, but in general, just there are so many crises right now around the world that there are so many crises right now around the world that have unpredictable outcomes and that nobody can really accurately predict the future of, that nobody can realistically predict where the global economy is going to go for the next 5 to 10 years. And that's not just me, being an individual who just has inherently limited insight. In general, even major market players, firms, financiers, traders, etc., all of these guys that specialize in tracking the global economy and trying to forecast where it's going so they can better allocate resources and reap more rewards, even they have been really struggling with this. The global economy has been whipsawing up and down and all over the place over the past 5 years between the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, the recovery from the pandemic, all this and the weather, all those disruptions, and political instability and wars and civil wars. All of these things are all happening at the same time, and it has left people working in markets just sort of baffled. They don't have the models or the precedent or the experience to know how to deal with this, and the result is unprecedentedly high uncertainty for a lot of market forces. And that's manifested in higher risk premiums. It's manifested as more difficulty getting loans, more reluctance to lend in risky markets like the developing world. It's having an impact, not least of which is planning. If you're a CEO or, a logistics guy involved in planning your operations years in the future, which is what you're supposed to do, that's extremely difficult right now. You know, people at the early stages of the pandemic were thinking, okay, there's going to be an economic depression, let's significantly cut capacity, close factories, lay people off, in the expectation that we're not going to need to produce nearly as much in the future. And so then what happens, like the next year, there's a big economic recovery, and suddenly there's a huge amount of demand that they cannot meet because they cut all that capacity. So now they've got all this economic growth, and they're thinking, okay, well, things are going to get better. We're going to be able to manage this just fine. And then suddenly there's all these supply snarls that refuse to go away. Energy prices go up, and they don't have no. They're suddenly juggling all of this new demand with all of these supply constraints that they weren't expecting. And those supply constraints don't really go away, like the inflation sticks. And the inflation itself was unexpected, and that required changes by planners. And then the war in Ukraine happened, and that caused a bunch of disruptions. And again, civil wars all over the world, just massive weather disruptions, like all of this stuff is happening in an unpredictable fashion that is really screwing with the private sector's ability to accurately forecast where the market is going to go. And correspondingly, the result is that the market is making a lot of bad moves that are resulting in misallocations of capital, wasted money, et cetera. So in general, the smart move right now is to just be conservative and cautious, right? It's not a great time right now to make bold moves, bold investments, whatnot, because you really have no ability to predict your ability to pay back the loans that you need to take on in order to make those investments. So, as the crises around the world proliferate and as the global market becomes more unpredictable, in general, you're going to see more gun-shy investors, globally speaking. You're going to see less entrepreneurship and just more corporate risk aversion generally around the world, which should be good for financial stability writ large, in so much as corporate risk is a source of financial instability. But the broader problem is going to be foregone economic growth that you lose for lack of investment. Every foregone investment is money that could have gone into growing the economy and giving jobs to people, giving people money, and giving them the opportunity to start their own businesses, invest in their own education, and further contribute down the line. So every foregone economic opportunity compounds over time, because that could have been the source for future economic growth that itself could generate new economic growth, et cetera, virtuous cycle, like I said before. So we'll see. I mean, I can't accurately tell you when prices will go back down. There's too many variables right now. Nobody really knows the answer to that.
Economics was described to me as a million-dimensional space, which is
Yeah.
rather unwieldy to make predictions on. That doesn't mean that there aren't people on the internet and on TV who won't make predictions. Predictions happen all the time, and they're fairly easy to make. You could even make a prediction as a total non-expert. You could say, I think that everything is going to go to shit in 5 years. That's a prediction that you can make. Doesn't mean it's true. Doesn't mean it's based on anything. But if you browse the internet long enough, you're going to find plenty of doomsday prophets and also prosperity gospel people who think that everything's going to be really good at some point, and they'll tell you to invest in GameStop stocks or some crypto coin, that kind of stuff. But it's very complicated. I was kind of thinking about similar questions of where do you see the world's economy in 20 years? It's kind of like how many spacefaring civilizations are there in the Andromeda galaxy? There are probably some. I have no idea how many. We don't know how many planets are populated with life. It's one of those pretty nebulous questions that you can guess at, and then you can make models based on certain answers to the question and then make preparations for those. But yeah, we're going to have to see, because we have the wild card element, which is touching on the other question of innovation, automation. Different breakthroughs are going to potentially change the landscape of how we buy stuff, how we communicate with each other, what services that we need to provide as physical humans versus what services can be provided by robots and by AI. We're not going to be able to know that, so we're just going to have to wait and see. But try your best to not make stupid moves. And if you do take a risk, know the risk that you're taking and try to make that proportionate to the amount of risk you're okay with taking.
Mm-hmm.
That's the thing I heard of with, I think it was Giphy Cat or something. It's just some image hosting website, and they folded recently, and people were saying it was because they were working with super low interest rates, and that was based on their business model, and they were pretty much gambling to make it big based on that, but it wasn't a sustainable long-term format. So if they didn't dominate the market, that wasn't going to work. And risk is also a key part of just different startups and inventors and stuff, like trying to gamble and see if they can make it big. When that happens, most of them will fail, but the ones that succeed can end up being very successful. So again, it's a very complicated space. I don't know shit about economics, so I'm not going to tell you how it is, but I appreciate you taking a crack at it.
No problem. My pleasure. I certainly spent enough time and money trying to learn it, so I'm glad I can get something out of it by helping you out there.
Mm-hmm.
We actually have somebody from Kosovo in the flags.
Kosovo.
Yeah, it was the breakaway Albanian province from Serbia. It's a lot of NATO conflict in the region stemming from that. Yeah, Kosovo's been very happening the past year. Lots of stuff going on there. I've actually got some of that in my notes. I'm guessing we're out of time, right?
If you want to touch on something real quick, you can.
Well, with Kosovo, basically their president. Well, I guess I should specify that there are regions of Kosovo that are majority Serb ethnically instead of ethnically Albanian. Specifically, I think in the northern part of Kosovo, if I'm not mistaken, around a town called Mitrovica, something like that. And recently, there's been unrest between the ethnic Serbs and the ethnic Albanians in Kosovo for a long time. But after Kosovo de facto gained its independence, the ethnic Serbs in the territory were not pleased. And they've done everything they can to, voice their displeasure at not being part of Serbia and trying to undermine the authority of the Kosovo government in majority Serb areas. So recently, the most recent drama is that there were a bunch of towns in northern Kosovo, the majority Serb parts, that had elections for mayoral positions in those towns. And, the ethnic Serb population was sufficiently upset with the Kosovo government that they decided to boycott the election. Now, the advice of the United States government to the Kosovo government is that they should delay the elections until such time as the boycott ended in order to kind of get the ethnic Serb population on side. They don't expect the Serbs to like the Kosovo government, but they do hope that if they can meet some of their demands, that they can at least still involve them in the political process, thereby maintaining some degree of legitimacy of the government. The Kosovo government elected to ignore this advice, much to the frustration of Washington. So the elections were held duly. Unsurprisingly, none of the ethnic Serb population voted, so ethnic Albanian politicians won these mayoral positions. The ethnic Serb population was not having it, and when these new mayors came to these towns to take their positions, the result was mass protests and the blockading of the city halls in these areas. Basically, they tried to physically prevent the elected mayors from coming to the city halls and taking their positions as mayors in these towns. Now, that was obviously going to be a point of contention, so the Kosovo government sent its police forces in to try to escort these mayors into these city halls in order to try to break these blockades, which put these police forces in direct confrontation with the ethnic Serb protesters. And the result was a whole series of clashes. You may have seen some of the images in media a couple weeks ago, but they got to be pretty fierce. And the interesting thing is that I believe NATO, either NATO or the European Union, I can't remember which, actually has troops deployed to Kosovo to help the government there with its security issues. And they were actually involved in that effort to try to break the protest line and get the mayors into the city halls. And the result is that a number of those peacekeepers, as they're called, were themselves attacked by the Serb protesters, much to the chagrin of the relevant authorities, which were not very happy with that. So overall, it's a giant shit show. The United States government pretty much knew that it would be violent and that it wouldn't go anywhere, and that the Kosovo government is basically just escalating things by trying to force these mayors on the northern Serb cities here that don't want them. And the result of the Kosovo government ignoring the advice of Washington has been that the United States government has actually started putting pressure on them. So it's denied them aid money and has basically just stopped cooperating with them as far as trying to get Serbia to recognize Kosovo independence, which is pretty awkward for Kosovo because, the United States was probably their biggest proponent as far as trying to, ensure continued independence of Kosovo in the face of endless Serbian pressure to try to reintegrate them. So it kind of seems like a bold move, pissing off your main benefactor like that. But I think the Europeans are still on board. So, they probably still have enough support to kind of protect themselves. But this has not really been a display of political acumen on the part of the Kosovo authorities here. From a nationalist Kosovo perspective, it makes sense, right? The Serb minority is not popular there for obvious reasons. So, trying to ignore the Serb boycott and force the mayors on them is a pretty popular political move for any politician in Kosovo, at least amongst the majority Albanian population. But doing so is not going to do anything to ameliorate the overarching problem as far as the lack of legitimacy the Kosovo government has in the minority Serb areas. So a popular but controversial move that's going to make things worse is what they're doing. And Washington is using some leverage to try to force them to do otherwise. But the Kosovo government, specifically the leadership of the Kosovo government, may not have the political willpower to do otherwise. So we'll see. Just the latest in what's been a long-running series of problems that have been afflicting the region over the past couple of years. I think the license plate drama was the one that happened before this. Serbia was starting to issue license plates to Serbs in Kosovo, which pissed off the Kosovo government and led to a minor confrontation. Yeah, the Balkans is always a happening place, but it's been much more happening for the past couple of years.
Yeah, chat was pointing out that the map is just really scuffed and weird of who has what territory and kind of wondering why. Seems like it's been in flux for the past
1,000 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been a while. It's not an uncommon problem in the region. Yeah, if you want to make the map of the Balkans even more interesting, what you can do is try to find a map of the Balkans that shows the different constituent republics of Bosnia. Because as part of the Dayton Accords, Bosnia was basically carved into two separate sub-national entities, one of which is the Croat Bosniak Federation, and the other one is Republika Srpska. And those two entities have weird borders, so it kind of further complicates the region's map when you could see those boundaries in addition to the international boundaries.
Well, nice. The world do be pretty happening. As always, if we messed up anything during the segment, feel free to give us a scathing review on YouTube and correct us. In addition, if you have a local perspective or you have family members who have firsthand experiences stuff, we love hearing about that. So feel free to share. We host these Sunday evenings, roughly 6 p.m. Pacific time start, and we go for 2 to 3 hours depending on energy. But thank you, Twitch chat, for sponsoring this Neuro Subathon so we can do consistent content like this on the internet. Agent Smith, thank you very much, as always, for your expertise and knowledge. I give you your 20-minute walk challenge. Did you make it the last week? You said it was very hot, and I don't want you to hurt yourself.
Actually, I did it today, and it was actually relatively mild out. I think because it had been raining.
Ah, yeah.
Yeah. I actually did walk in the rain, but it was just a light drizzle, so it wasn't like nearly as bad as the last time.
Okay, so now Chad is going to visualize Agent Smith as an edgy action movie star who's contemplating the world as he walks through the rain.
There you go.
Let's get an art commission.
There you go. All right, challenge accepted. I am going to have to probably skip next week because I have a meeting with some friends and family next Sunday.
Cool. Well, thanks for letting me know.
Yeah, so my apologies. I hate to leave you hanging out to dry during your big subathon thing.
Oh, it's all good. We have lots of stuff to do. I have a huge list of things that I need to now catch up with because the support has been so massive. But as always, thank you, Agent Smith, for your time and your knowledge and your contributions. And we will see you on the next episode of Well Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah, thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG.